She was England's brightest flame and the loneliest soul in her kingdom. To her enemies, she was a heretic. To her people, a savior. To history, she was something rarer. The woman who chose a crown over love and changed the world. Like, share, and subscribe, because every empire begins with a story. She entered the world in September of 1533, in a palace heavy with disappointment. They had prepared for a prince banners woven in blue, trumpets waiting for the cry of a male heir who would secure the Tudor throne forever. Instead, a girl was born. They named her Elizabeth, after both her grandmothers, a name that meant God is my oath. Her father, King Henry VIII, had risked his kingdom for her birth, torn England from Rome, defied the Pope, and married her mother, Anne Boleyn, in a union drenched in scandal and blood. The child should have been the promise of triumph, but in the glittering halls of Greenwich Palace, triumph turned to silence. Henry looked upon the infant and said little. He would call her his daughter, but never his heir. Anne Boleyn smiled through her terror. She had promised Henry a son, sworn that God himself had blessed their love. Now, as Elizabeth was swaddled in royal silk, Anne felt the crown tighten like a noose. The court murmured behind closed doors. A daughter, not a son. They whispered that the marriage was cursed, that the Pope's anger had condemned the child before her first breath. And so, Elizabeth's life began not in celebration, but in suspicion. By the time she could walk, she had already learned silence. In the golden nursery of Hatfield House, she was watched by servants who feared to speak her name too loudly. Her half-sister, Mary, daughter of the Spanish Queen, Catherine of Aragon, had been declared illegitimate when Henry annulled his first marriage. Now, with Elizabeth's birth, that same danger hung above her. Henry's court was a battlefield of silk and smiles, ambassadors, bishops, and nobles shifting alliances with every breath. The child's mother, Anne Boleyn, played her part like a chess master, but the board was already turning against her. The king's favor was as fickle as the wind. By 1536, Anne had failed to give him a son. She miscarried twice the last time, a boy. Henry's patience cracked, and the courtiers smelled blood. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally, now saw her as an obstacle. The whispers grew darker. Witchcraft, adultery, treason. And then, on a May morning, the bells of London rang not for a coronation, but for an execution. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, knelt before the French swordsman on the scaffold at the Tower of London. The crowd watched as the wind caught her black hair, her lips murmuring prayers in French. Elizabeth was 2 years old. When the blade fell, the child's world ended before she could understand what it meant. Her mother's name was erased from court records, her servants dismissed, her title stripped. The daughter of the queen became the bastard of a traitor. She was sent away from court to a small household under watch. Her governesses changed, her tutors rotated. But one constant remained: fear. No one in Henry's England was safe from royal mood or rumor. To be near Elizabeth was to live in danger. The shadow of her mother's ghost followed her everywhere. Yet, even as a child, Elizabeth absorbed the lessons the court had carved into her life. She learned that survival meant silence, that love, even a father's love, was conditional, and that the crown, shimmering above her father's head, could turn into a blade without warning. Henry remarried again and again. Jane Seymour gave him the son he craved, Edward. For that, she died in childbirth, becoming the one wife Henry mourned. Anne of Cleves, discarded. Catherine Howard, executed, another young queen brought low by ambition. Each downfall was a warning carved into Elizabeth's heart: never trust desire, never trust the throne. By the time she turned 10, Elizabeth was the quiet observer in a storm of thrones. Her hair was her mother's auburn, her eyes sharp like her father's. Those who met her spoke of an uncanny poise, a child who listened more than she spoke, who watched everything and forgot nothing. She mastered Latin, Greek, French, and Italian before most girls her age had learned to sew. Her tutor, the scholar Roger Ascham, once wrote that she had the mind of a man and the patience of a saint. But what Elizabeth learned most was the art of masking her heart. Her half-sister Mary, still bitter and exiled, saw in her a rival. Her brother Edward, frail but adored, would inherit the throne, Elizabeth was caught between them, a ghost of treason's child, tolerated but never trusted. At court, courtiers bowed to her face and mocked her bloodline behind her back. She was Anne Boleyn's daughter, after all, clever, charming, and dangerous. And so, Elizabeth grew in the garden of suspicion, a solitary rose among thorns. In 1547, her father's health began to collapse. Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of Europe, was now swollen with age and regret. He had outlived 4 of his 6 wives and ruled a nation divided between faith and fear. Elizabeth was summoned to Whitehall to see him one last time. The old king sat upon his throne like a mountain of flesh, his leg ulcer bandaged, his eyes small and watchful. When she knelt before him, he placed his heavy hand upon her hair. Perhaps for a moment, he saw not the daughter of Anne Boleyn, but the reflection of the woman he once loved, or the guilt of the wife he had killed. Whatever he saw, it was gone in an instant. He dismissed her without affection or farewell. Days later, the king died. The bells of London tolled again, and Elizabeth, only 13, watched the kingdom of her father crumble into mourning. The boy king Edward VI would inherit the throne, and the court would shift again. For the second time in her life, Elizabeth's world changed overnight. But this time, she would be ready. She had learned that to survive England's crown, she must never depend on anyone and never love too deeply. In a kingdom built on blood and vows, she learned her first lesson, that every crown is a blade, and every daughter of treason must learn to dance upon it. When King Henry VIII was laid to rest at Windsor in January 1547, the kingdom he left behind was more fragile than his courtiers dared admit. His only son, Edward VI, was a boy of 9, intelligent, pious, and already burdened by the impossible weight of his father's shadow. The court became a hive of ambition. Behind the black banners of mourning, knives glimmered. Each noble sought to place his hand upon the new king's shoulder and through him, upon England's crown. Elizabeth, now 13, stood at the edge of this world. She had learned to wear humility like armor. Though she was the daughter of a disgraced queen, her intelligence could not be hidden. She was too clever, too poised, and far too dangerous for those who understood how swiftly the wheel of fortune could turn. The protectorate fell to Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, uncle to the boy king and brother of Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. The new Lord Protector ruled in his nephew's name, and England turned its gaze from the decaying past to the uncertain future of a Protestant reign. Elizabeth watched carefully. The old religion, the Latin Mass, the golden icons, the soft murmur of priests was being stripped away, replaced by sermons in English and a colder faith built on words rather than ceremony. The girl who had been taught to cross herself now learned to question everything. Somerset's rule was rigid, but brief. Greed, envy, and pride began to tear the regency apart. And into this chaos stepped a man who would change Elizabeth's life, Thomas Seymour, Somerset's younger brother. Thomas was handsome, reckless, and dangerously charming, the kind of man who mistook ambition for destiny. He had been close to Henry VIII's last wife, Catherine Parr, who survived the king and now lived as the Dowager Queen. Within months of Henry's death, Thomas married her in secret, scandalizing the court. Catherine was intelligent, learned, and kind. She had been a mother figure to Elizabeth in Henry's final years, offering protection and affection the girl had never known. When Catherine invited Elizabeth to live with her and her new husband at Chelsea, it seemed a blessing. But what began as sanctuary soon turned to shadow. Thomas Seymour's charm masked a dangerous hunger for power, for influence, and perhaps for the young princess herself. He would enter Elizabeth's chamber before dawn, laughing as he found her half-dressed, claiming it was harmless jest. He would chase her through the gardens, tickling and teasing until the governess intervened. Catherine, at first amused, began to see the unease in her stepdaughter's eyes. Elizabeth was 14, intelligent beyond her years, yet still too young to understand the boundaries he crossed. Rumors began to whisper through the household. The queen's laughter turned brittle, and when she discovered her husband and Elizabeth alone one morning, the truth could no longer be ignored. Within days, the girl was sent away, dismissed to the country with polite haste. Catherine's heart was broken. She died soon after in childbirth, her marriage to Thomas ending in tragedy. Elizabeth, alone again, buried the experience deep within herself. She had learned another of the Tudor world's cruel lessons, that affection was never innocent, and every kindness came with a cost. Back at Hatfield, she rebuilt her household small, disciplined, and loyal. Her studies continued: philosophy, theology, mathematics, languages. Every day she wrote in her diary in Latin, practicing the control of thought that would later shape her reign. Her reputation grew. Courtiers began to remark that the young princess spoke like a scholar, reasoned like a statesman, and carried herself like a queen. Yet the shadows of scandal followed her still. In 1549, Thomas Seymour, unable to resist ambition, plotted to kidnap the young King Edward and rule in his name. He was caught before he could act. Letters, servants, and witnesses tied him to treason and to Elizabeth. Summoned to London for questioning, the 15-year-old girl stood before a panel of grim-faced men, the very council that had once condemned her mother. They demanded to know the truth of her relationship with Seymour. Elizabeth did not flinch. Her answers were precise, her tone calm. "I do not deny that he did seek my company," she said, "but never with my consent to wrong." She never raised her voice, never betrayed fear. Every word was chosen like a blade. In private, she wept not for Seymour, but for the peril of being her mother's daughter. She had seen how a man's desire could destroy a woman's name, how rumor could become weapon, and how innocence meant nothing when the crown was near. When Seymour was executed at the Tower that spring, the sound of his death bell echoed faintly through Hatfield's halls. Elizabeth said nothing, but her servants saw her standing at her window that morning, her face pale as marble. Later she whispered, "This day died a man of much wit, but little judgment." It was not grief, it was survival. By 17, Elizabeth had become an enigma to the court. Neither child nor woman, neither saint nor sinner. She spoke carefully, smiled rarely, and trusted almost no one. Her brother, King Edward, grew into a devout young reformer, steering England deeper into Protestant faith. To him, Elizabeth was both ally and rival, a symbol of the future but also a reminder of the family's fractured past. The nation he ruled was restless. Rebellions flared in the north and west, and whispers of Catholic plots haunted every churchyard. The boy king's health, always fragile, began to fail. For Elizabeth, the years between girlhood and power were years of testing, each season marked by exile, suspicion, and survival. And when Edward's cough deepened and his eyes dimmed, the courtiers began their dance again. The throne of England trembled once more, and in its long shadow stood the daughter of treason, the girl who had learned to endure what others could not. Before she became Gloriana, she was a ghost in her own kingdom, a child who watched every smile, every word, every execution, and understood, long before she ruled, that to live among kings, one must become more dangerous than any of them. Every crown begins with chains. The summer of 1549 settled over England like a fever that refused to break. The king was still a boy, the council was fractured, and rebellion bled through the shires. Fields that had once been green with promise now bore the scars of fire and the echoes of sermons that spoke of sin and sovereignty in equal measure. Elizabeth, now 16, lived at Hatfield with a household smaller and quieter than any befitting a royal child. The laughter of her childhood had faded into study and silence. She had seen too much to trust comfort. Books became her companions: Cicero, Plato, Scripture. In every page, she sought patterns of power and survival. The fall of Thomas Seymour had marked her deeply. He had been executed as a traitor, but his crime was not merely ambition, it was intimacy. To be desired by a man so close to the throne had nearly destroyed her. She learned from that lesson with a clarity that would guide her forever. Affection could be fatal, and virtue was a weapon sharper than any blade. From her window she watched the seasons change and England with them. The Protestant reformers gained influence under her half-brother Edward VI. Churches stripped of color and saints, priests forbidden to whisper Latin prayers. To Elizabeth, raised in a house of old faith and royal violence, these changes felt both liberating and cruel. The new religion promised truth, yet demanded obedience. It spoke of freedom, but burned heretics in market squares. At court, factions rose and fell with the speed of rumor. The Duke of Somerset, once the boy king's protector, was accused of treason and imprisoned in the Tower. His rival, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, climbed into power with the grace of a serpent. Dudley's name would later haunt Elizabeth through his son Robert, but for now, she studied from afar, learning the rhythm of ambition. In her letters to the council, she wrote with impeccable restraint, each phrase polished like armor. "Your Majesty's most humble and faithful sister," she signed them, though she knew too well how quickly loyalty could become suspicion. In London, the young King Edward grew thinner each winter. The cough that plagued him worsened. Physicians bled him, prayed over him, and dosed him with bitter remedies. But nothing eased the wasting sickness that hollowed his cheeks. He had inherited his father's intellect, but none of his strength. While Edward's health waned, England's soul burned. The countryside seethed with anger, peasants driven from land, wages cut, faith torn apart. In Norfolk, rebels marched under banners demanding the king's true religion, though few could agree what that meant. From Cornwall to Yorkshire, rumors of divine punishment spread with the speed of plague. Elizabeth remained outwardly untouched, yet she listened to every whisper. She had learned that rebellion was the music of England, playing in a different key each generation. When Somerset was executed in 1552, she made no public comment. Privately, she understood the pattern. One protector replaced another. One faction devoured the last. Her father had ruled by destroying his enemies. Her brother's ministers destroyed each other. The crown, she realized, was not a prize, it was a battlefield no one ever left alive. In early 1553, the boy king's decline could no longer be hidden. Courtiers began to count the days. Edward, desperate to preserve his Protestant vision, feared his half-sister Mary, the devout Catholic who waited as the next in line. To him, her faith was treason against God. Under the influence of the cunning Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, now the realm's master, Edward drafted a new succession. It excluded both his half-sisters and placed Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's daughter-in-law, as heir. Elizabeth knew the document was poison. She was too clever to protest openly, and too cautious to endorse it. In silence, she thought, lies safety. When Edward VI died that July, England was a powder keg waiting for the spark. Northumberland proclaimed Jane Grey queen. She was 17, pious, and doomed. In the Tower of London, she accepted the crown with trembling hands, while in the countryside Mary Tudor rode under the banner of legitimacy. Elizabeth watched the storm gather. For 9 days, England had 2 queens. Then the tide turned. Mary's supporters swelled lords, soldiers, and commoners alike. The rebellion that Northumberland feared most came from his own conscience. Few men would fight against a daughter of Henry VIII. Mary entered London triumphant, the crowds chanting her name as bells rang across the Thames. Elizabeth rode to greet her half-sister, dressed in white to symbolize peace. For a moment, the 2 women embraced. The people cheered, the daughters of Henry reunited, the kingdom whole again. But even in that first embrace, Elizabeth felt the weight of Mary's gaze. Behind the smile was suspicion. Behind the hymns of reunion, the rustle of chains waiting to be used. The new queen was 40, unmarried, and fiercely Catholic. To her, Elizabeth represented everything she feared: youth, popularity, and the Protestant cause. Worse still, she was the living image of Anne Boleyn, the woman Mary had been taught to despise since childhood. The bond between them, fragile from the start, began to fray within weeks. Mary's reign opened with fire. Her marriage plans with Philip of Spain, the most powerful Catholic prince in Europe, enraged the English people. They feared the country would become a Spanish province. Rebellions brewed, the largest led by Sir Thomas Wyatt in 1554. The uprising failed, but its echo reached directly to Elizabeth's door. Letters found among the rebels hinted at her name. The implication was enough. The Queen's Council declared her complicit. Without trial, without defense, the princess was seized and carried to the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had met her death. On a raw March morning, as the heavy gates shut behind her, Elizabeth understood how quickly fortune turned. She was 21, unwed, unarmed, and utterly alone. The ravens screamed from the battlements as she passed. Beneath her feet lay the graves of queens and traitors, indistinguishable in the same cold earth. She was lodged in the same set of rooms once used by Anne Boleyn, the walls still etched with the marks of forgotten prayers. That night, by candlelight, Elizabeth read from the Psalms, "Put not your trust in princes, nor in the sons of men." The guards could hear her whisper the words again and again until dawn. The tower had its own kind of silence, heavy, watchful, eternal. Every hour that passed was a reminder that few who entered left alive. Elizabeth understood this well. The same walls had echoed her mother's final footsteps 2 decades earlier. Now, her own fate balanced on the same edge of fear and faith. The cold April winds cut through the narrow slits of her window. Guards patrolled the courtyard below, their boots scraping over ancient stone. Every morning she woke, expecting to hear the steps that would lead her to the scaffold. Across the river, the bells of street palls tolled for Catholic masses again. England was turning backward, the Latin chants, the gilded crosses, the old religion resurrected by her sister's will. Heretics burned in Smithfield Market, the smell of smoke and flesh drifting on the wind. To Mary, this was redemption. To Elizabeth, it was warning. She had learned how to survive men. Now she learned how to survive faith. The Queen's counselors demanded confessions. They questioned her servants, her secretaries, anyone who had ever written her name. She was accused of conspiring with the rebels of Wyatt's uprising, of seeking the crown for herself. But evidence was scarce, and Elizabeth refused to yield. She would neither confess nor protest too much. She stayed poised, too proud for guilt, too calm for innocence. When Mary hesitated to sign her death warrant, it was not mercy that saved Elizabeth, but politics. Too many feared the reaction of the people. The young princess was beloved. To execute her would be to make a martyr out of youth and hope itself. So she remained in the tower, half forgotten, watched by spies and priests who noted every prayer and every sigh. In her solitude, she read constantly Livy, Seneca, the English Psalms. Her handwriting grew smaller, sharper, more controlled. She began to translate the works of Boethius, the philosopher of fortune and exile. In his words she found kinship. All fortune is good, for if it be good, it delights, and if it be bad, it teaches. In that phrase, Elizabeth found the creed of her life. Weeks turned into months. Then one morning, without warning, the doors opened. She was ordered to leave. A royal guard escorted her from the tower to Richmond Palace, where she would live under house arrest. The journey by boat down the Thames was slow, the river thick with spring rain. People gathered silently along the banks to watch. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered blessings. None spoke aloud, for fear of spies. Elizabeth sat upright in the small barge, her face pale, her eyes unreadable. Behind her, the tower faded into the mist, the fortress that had claimed her mother and nearly her own life. She was free, but only just. Her captivity continued in all but name. She was kept under watch at Woodstock and then Hatfield, surrounded by guards who recorded her every word. Letters were opened, visitors denied, yet even in confinement, she found ways to rule herself. Each morning she read the scriptures, then wrote in ciphered notes to her few remaining allies. She trained her mind to weigh motives, to test loyalty, to calculate time. Her health suffered. The years of fear etched themselves into her posture, the slight stiffness of her neck, the stillness in her movements. But the quiet also hardened her spirit. Mary's reign grew darker. The marriage to Philip of Spain proved disastrous. The people despised the foreign prince who treated their queen with cold courtesy. The fires of religious persecution spread across England. Protestants fled to Geneva and Antwerp. Those who stayed risked death by flame. Elizabeth's name became a whisper of deliverance. To the faithful who still dreamed of reform, she was the candle that refused to go out. To Catholics at court, she was the ember of heresy waiting to reignite. Mary's body, weakened by illness and sorrow, could not bear an heir. Each false pregnancy deepened her despair. She saw in Elizabeth's survival a divine mockery, the living reminder of her father's sins and her own failures. By 1557, war with France drained England's coffers. The loss of Calais, England's last foothold on the continent, broke Mary's heart. "When I die," she is said to have murmured, "they will find Calais written on my heart." The same year, Elizabeth was summoned again to court. The summons might have been her death or her redemption. She arrived dressed in mourning black, her bearing modest, her expression serene. Mary, older and gaunter now, received her half-sister with a fragile civility. No words of love passed between them, but something like resignation did. For the first time, Elizabeth saw not the queen, but the woman behind the crown, worn by grief, betrayed by hope. It was the first lesson of mercy she would ever learn. When Mary's health failed completely in 1558, the court was already shifting in quiet preparation. Spain's influence waned. Her counselors began to whisper Elizabeth's name again. On the morning of November 17th, the Queen died. The bells of London tolled once more, not for a heretic or a martyr, but for the end of an age. At Hatfield, Elizabeth knelt in the gardens when the riders arrived. Mud clung to their boots and frost to their cloaks. They bowed deeply before her. The messenger spoke only 7 words that would change the world. "Your Majesty the Queen is dead." Elizabeth rose slowly, her face unreadable. The wind stirred the leaves around her, carrying the echo of the bells from London. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, softly, she crossed herself not in defiance of faith, but in memory of all she had survived. Around her, the winter air felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. The prisoner princess had endured the Tower, the Council, and the shadow of the pyre. Now, she would inherit the very crown that had nearly destroyed her. She had been forged in silence, tempered by fear, and baptized in fire. The woman who walked free from the Tower would never be captive again. She ruled a kingdom that doubted her and a heart that betrayed her. When Elizabeth awoke as queen, England itself seemed to hold its breath. It was November 1558, a season of frost, famine, and exhausted faith. The fires of religious persecution still smoldered, their smoke staining the memory of Queen Mary's reign. The bells that tolled for Mary's soul also rang for renewal, though no one yet dared to believe it. From the first moment, Elizabeth understood that her crown was not a gift, but a gamble. She had inherited a kingdom divided by creed, drained by war, and distrustful of monarchs. Yet within her burned a strange calm, not triumph, but readiness. At 25, she had already endured what most monarchs never would: scandal, imprisonment, near death. Now, that same endurance became her armor. The lessons of survival were about to become the art of rule. When she rode from Hatfield to London to claim her throne, the roads were lined with thousands of her people, peasants, merchants, clergy, all come to glimpse the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the ghost reborn. Snow fell softly, catching in her hair like a crown of frost. Observers later wrote that she smiled at the crowd, as if she would embrace them all. But beneath the grace was calculation. She knew what they needed to see. Not another tyrant, not another zealot, but something entirely new. Her coronation, held in January 1559, shimmered with deliberate symbolism. Latin and English prayers mingled. Protestant psalms rose where Catholic incense had once choked the air. The new queen wore robes heavy with Tudor gold. Her gaze lifted to the vaulted ceiling of Westminster Abbey, not in piety alone, but in silent defiance of those who said a woman could not rule. The people roared her name, Elizabeth Regina, a monarch without a husband, a survivor without apology. Yet even as the cheers filled the abbey, the question already haunted her court: whom would she marry? To her counselors, marriage meant security, an heir to continue the line, an alliance to protect the throne. To Elizabeth, it meant something else entirely: danger. She remembered Catherine Parr's tears, Catherine Howard's execution, her own mother's fall. Marriage was a crown of iron. It glittered, but it killed. Still, she played the part. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and Austria presented their princes with portraits and promises. She listened, smiled, and dismissed them with grace. Behind every polite refusal, she weighed the risk of surrendering herself to any man's power. Among the courtiers who filled her glittering, perilous world was one she could not so easily dismiss: Robert Dudley, son of the Duke of Northumberland, had known Elizabeth since childhood. They shared the memory of the Tower, he as a prisoner after his father's fall, she as the captive princess who might never see daylight again. Now he returned as master of the horse, the man closest to her in ceremony and in sight. He was bold, handsome, and restless, with the kind of confidence born from surviving disgrace. To the Queen, he was both reminder and temptation. Every morning, Dudley stood beside her horse as she rode through the palace gardens. Every evening, he attended her chambers with petitions and reports. The courtiers watched, whispered, and speculated. Elizabeth encouraged the attention. She had learned that power thrived on uncertainty. If Europe's princes believed she might marry, they courted her alliance. If her nobles thought she loved, they stayed loyal. Love, for her, became another kind of statecraft. But rumor has its own gravity. It pulled at every movement, every glance. At court, the talk grew darker. The Queen and her favorite, the shadow of scandal rising again, as it had with Seymour. Worse still, Dudley was already married to Amy Robsart, a quiet noblewoman living far from London. Elizabeth ignored the whispers, or seemed to. She needed Dudley not only for the thrill he represented, but for the political control he offered. He was her link to the Protestant faction, her balance against the Catholic lords who still dreamt of Rome's return. Yet she also knew how dangerous a man's devotion could be. In council, she ruled with frost and flame. Her ministers, Cecil, Bacon, Walsingham, learned to read her silences. She could listen for an hour without a word, then deliver a judgment so precise it left seasoned men trembling. Her vision for England was not born of idealism but of experience. Stability through ambiguity, peace through delay. She would not reopen the wounds of faith with persecution, nor would she bow to papal authority. Instead, she created a new path, the Elizabethan settlement, a fragile compromise that made Protestantism the state religion, but allowed a quiet tolerance for those who worshiped differently. It was neither Rome nor Geneva, but something entirely English. The Act of Supremacy named her supreme governor of the Church of England. Some wanted head of the church, but she refused the title. Governor sounded humbler, safer, yet all power flowed from her hand. By choosing ambiguity, she built endurance. As spring of 1560 approached, her first years on the throne shimmered with fragile triumph. England's treasury, long emptied by her father and sister, began to refill. The navy rebuilt, the economy revived. But peace was a mirage. Beyond the Channel, France and Spain watched her every move, each hoping to reclaim England for Catholicism. Across the border, Mary, Queen of Scots, young, beautiful, and Catholic, became the darling of Europe. Married to the French Dauphin, she bore the title Queen of Scotland and of England by right. To her enemies, Elizabeth was a usurper born of adultery. To Mary, she was an obstacle to destiny. The stage was set for a duel between crowns that would shape the century. But even before that reckoning, tragedy would return to Elizabeth's own doorstep. In September 1560, as Parliament met in Westminster, news arrived from Oxfordshire. Amy Robsart, wife of Robert Dudley, had been found dead at the foot of a staircase. Her neck was broken. The verdict, accident. But the rumor, murder. The court froze. Every whisper, every sidelong glance turned toward the Queen and her favorite. For a moment, all her careful balance trembled. Elizabeth did not mourn publicly. She withdrew from court, her letters to Dudley cautious, her tone distant. She understood that one man's fall could bring her own. Even as grief and suspicion swirled, she appeared before her council radiant and composed. "I have no master," she said to them once, not as boast, but as truth. And in that moment, the image of the Virgin Queen began to take shape, not yet divine, not yet myth, but forged from the ashes of love, scandal, and survival. She had climbed from the tower to the throne, not by miracle, but by mastery. A woman alone in a man's kingdom, learning that to rule hearts was more dangerous than to rule nations. The death of Amy Robsart lingered like a storm over the early years of Elizabeth's reign. Though no court in England declared Robert Dudley guilty, no man or woman could hear the story without suspicion. A staircase, a broken neck, a husband at the Queen's side, it was the perfect tragedy for poets, enemies, and spies alike. Elizabeth understood at once that her greatest threat was not rebellion or invasion, but perception. She had built her power on the delicate illusion that she was untouchable, neither wife, nor widow, nor woman to be owned. Now that illusion cracked, and through the fracture, England stared into scandal. In the tense weeks that followed, ambassadors wrote feverishly to their masters in Paris and Madrid, describing the atmosphere of court with the precision of surgeons. Some claimed Elizabeth wept for Dudley, others that she exiled him in fury. None agreed on the truth, because she offered them none. Her silence was her defense. In that silence, her myth began. The woman who had once been doubted, imprisoned, and nearly condemned for another man's ambition, now turned every rumor into theater. She summoned her council, appeared radiant in white silk, and announced her devotion to the kingdom above all earthly ties. "I am married," she declared to her people soon after, "to England." The words were repeated, embroidered, and eventually immortalized. But what they concealed was deeper than loyalty. They hid fear. Elizabeth had seen too well what marriage meant for queens. Her mother had lost her head for it. Catherine Howard, her cousin, had followed. Mary Tudor had been undone by it. If love was a battlefield, Elizabeth meant to fight alone. England, though weary of scandal, began to heal beneath her command. Her council, anchored by the shrewd and tireless William Cecil, pursued policies that steadied the fragile realm. Taxes eased, trade revived. Ships built under Henry's reign returned to the seas with renewed purpose, carrying England's flag farther than it had ever gone. Yet beneath the calm surface of order, the old rivalries burned. The Catholic powers of Europe, especially Spain, regarded Elizabeth as a heretic and illegitimate sovereign. They watched and waited, expecting the English to turn on their Protestant queen as they had turned on so many before. And in Scotland, the threat wore a crown. Mary, Queen of Scots, barely 19, returned from France a widow and a queen in her own right. She was the mirror of everything Elizabeth was not: openly feminine, unapologetically Catholic, and adored by those who still longed for the old religion. To Mary, the English throne was her birthright. To Elizabeth, it was the cornerstone of survival. The two women would never meet, yet their lives became entangled in a web of politics, faith, and fatal resemblance. The nobility compared them in whispers: Mary, the woman of beauty and passion; Elizabeth, the queen of intellect and restraint. The choice between them seemed a choice between two futures for Europe itself. Elizabeth, aware of every whisper, began to craft her image with a precision born of necessity. Painters were forbidden to portray her without permission. Every portrait was inspected for meaning. The eyes must be bright, the skin luminous, the face serene, the embodiment of divine order. Behind that perfect calm was a woman who could not afford to age, love, or falter. As England's enemies painted her as a bastard usurper, she made herself a symbol of purity and power, the Virgin Queen, the living emblem of a Protestant empire. The transformation was not vanity, it was armor. Still, the price of control was solitude. Her nights grew longer, the corridors of her palaces colder. She wrote less in her journals and more in state papers. The language of affection was replaced by the grammar of command. Robert Dudley remained at court, but the intimacy that had once drawn them together became a weapon others used to divide them. The council tolerated him only because Elizabeth demanded it. Foreign ambassadors called him her secret husband. Poets called him her ruin. The queen neither dismissed him nor drew him close. She kept him precisely where she kept all things she feared within sight, never within reach. For the rest of her life, Dudley would remain a ghost moving through her reign, a reminder of what she had sacrificed to keep the throne. Meanwhile, England's political horizon darkened. Across the Channel, war between France and Spain raged on. The northern border bristled with tension as Scottish nobles loyal to Mary threatened rebellion. Elizabeth's council urged her to send troops to secure Scotland before Catholic France could use it as a launching ground for invasion. She agreed, reluctantly, dispatching English forces under Lord Grey to support the Protestant lords rebelling against Mary's regent. It was Elizabeth's first military venture as queen, and it tested her will. She had inherited her father's decisiveness but not his appetite for blood. War was never her instinct, survival was. In 1560, the Treaty of Edinburgh brought a fragile peace. French troops withdrew from Scotland, leaving the Protestant faction ascendant. Mary returned home to a land that no longer worshipped her faith, while Elizabeth stood as the unchallenged ruler of England's destiny. Yet victory brought little comfort. That same summer, Robert Dudley's wife was buried quietly, her death still unsolved, her name a shadow over the court. Though no verdict of murder was ever proven, the stain remained. Elizabeth understood that even innocence could not erase suspicion. When foreign princes again proposed marriage, she smiled and refused. By denying every alliance, she made England unpredictable. By choosing no husband, she made herself indispensable. Her counselors grumbled, her people speculated, and poets idealized. But beneath the myth was a private vow. Never again would her fate rest in another's hands. The second year of her reign ended, as it had begun, with England precariously balanced between ruin and rebirth. The fields prospered, the ports reopened, the plague receded. In London, craftsmen carved her initials into coins, and children sang rhymes of Good Queen Bess. But in Europe's courts, her enemies called her worse names: the heretic queen, the bastard daughter, the woman of deception. Elizabeth listened to all of it and smiled. The louder they spoke, the stronger her silence became. She knew that queens were not remembered for being loved, only for being feared and never forgotten. She had risen not because fate was kind, but because she learned to make fear her servant. In every smile, a warning. In every mercy, a test. The age of Elizabeth had begun. When the year 1561 dawned, Elizabeth was 28, young by any reckoning, but already a creature of myth. She ruled from palaces that echoed with her father's ghosts, walked corridors once stained by her mother's blood, and wore a crown that seemed to weigh the sins of every Tudor who came before her. The court expected an announcement. Every rumor, every foreign envoy, every noblewoman dressing for the morning expected the Queen of England to choose a husband. Marriage was not merely personal. It was the foundation of the state. But Elizabeth had no intention of obeying the world's expectation. Each day brought her another proposal, from the Archduke Charles of Austria, from the Prince of Sweden, from King Philip of Spain, who had once been her sister's husband. To each she offered the same dance of courtesy and delay, neither accepting nor rejecting, until diplomacy turned to exhaustion. She had studied men her entire life: kings who lost crowns for love, princes who traded peace for passion, and courtiers whose ambition devoured them. She knew the truth that few dared to say aloud. In a world ruled by men, marriage was surrender disguised as union. So she built her fortress in abstention. As the ambassadors pleaded and the council debated, Elizabeth perfected her craft, the art of evasion as policy. She smiled as she refused, charmed as she delayed, and left every man certain he might still win her hand. It was not deception, it was survival. The Virgin Queen was not born in a chapel. She was forged in the court of politics, where every kiss was a weapon and every promise a chain. Across the northern border, another queen prepared her own destiny. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had returned from France that same year, widowed before 20, carrying both a crown and a claim to England. She had been raised amid the glitter of the French court, elegant, Catholic, and dangerous. To her supporters, she was the rightful heir to Henry VIII's throne. To Elizabeth, she was the embodiment of everything that threatened her reign. The two women never met, yet they studied each other with a fascination born of reflection. Mary was the Queen Elizabeth could have been young, adored, and bound by passion. Elizabeth was the Queen Mary could never become, solitary, self-made, and unyielding. The mirror between them grew sharper with each passing year. As Mary governed her turbulent Scottish realm, rebellion and rumor followed her. Her marriage to Lord Darnley, a man as beautiful as he was reckless, turned swiftly from celebration to scandal. The union, intended to strengthen her claim to England, instead shattered her kingdom. Elizabeth watched from Whitehall as the drama unfolded, a queen undone by her own heart. To her counselors, it was proof of divine favor. The Virgin Queen's restraint had spared England the chaos now consuming its neighbor. But Elizabeth did not gloat. She studied Mary's fall as one might study an omen, for beneath her coolness lay a deep, private knowledge that she too had felt the pull of love, the ache of loneliness, the whisper that power meant nothing when one's soul starved for affection. And yet she resisted. Always she resisted. England, meanwhile, grew restless beneath its queen's contradictions. She demanded loyalty but offered few heirs. She embodied chastity, yet inspired desire. Her courtiers, poets, and painters transformed her into something beyond mortal, an icon draped in gold and legend, the living emblem of divine rule. It was more than flattery. It was strategy. Elizabeth's reign required the illusion of permanence. A married queen could be replaced by her husband's will, a mother by her child's inheritance. But a virgin queen, eternal, ageless, indivisible, could never be displaced. And so the imagery spread. Portraits of Elizabeth surrounded by roses and suns, poems comparing her to Diana, the goddess untouched. Her courtiers learned to speak in reverence, her subjects to dream in symbolism. The more she denied love, the more her nation adored her. But her enemies saw the same purity as weakness. To Catholic Europe, Elizabeth's virginity was not virtue, it was proof of unnatural pride. A woman refusing her ordained place beneath a man. The Pope himself called her the heretic whore of Babylon. It was not mere insult, it was prelude to war. In 1563, plague struck London, silencing its bustling markets and emptying its theaters. Elizabeth retreated to Windsor, the air thick with the scent of mortality. As her people suffered, foreign powers whispered that England's queen would soon die without an heir. France and Spain circled like vultures, waiting to divide the island once she was gone. Yet the queen endured, as she always had, through silence and steel. The middle years of the 1560 seconds tested her patience and her heart. Robert Dudley remained her constant companion, now ennobled as Earl of Leicester, his ambition tempered by devotion. They shared a bond deeper than politics, but one forever bounded by the crown between them. To yield to him would be to surrender everything she had fought to become. Still, she could not bring herself to banish him. Their relationship became a paradox. England learned to live with whispered scandal and visible loyalty, love disguised as statecraft. But when Dudley married another woman in secret, the Queen's fury shook the court. It was not jealousy alone, it was betrayal of an image she had carefully built. Her courtiers saw the tremor beneath the mask and knew the truth. Even queens bleed where the heart once lived. From that moment, Elizabeth's affection hardened into myth. Love became memory. Policy became prayer. By 1568, the world around her had transformed. Mary, Queen of Scots, now a fugitive, fled south into England seeking refuge from her rebellious nobles and the suspicion that she had conspired in Darnley's murder. Elizabeth received the news with calculated calm. Here was her greatest rival, delivered into her hands not by armies, but by fate. The question that would define her reign had arrived. What does a queen do when her mirror kneels before her throne? Elizabeth's counselors urged imprisonment. Others whispered execution. But she hesitated, knowing that one queen's death might curse another's crown. For all her intellect, all her iron will, Elizabeth had always understood the fragility of power, that it was less a possession than a performance, sustained by perception. She resolved, for now, to let Mary live. Yet even as she signed the order for her cousin's custody, she sensed that mercy could be its own kind of trap. Two queens could not exist forever in one kingdom, and as the ink dried, Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, the Virgin Queen of England, began to understand that her greatest battles would not be fought with swords, but with shadows. She ruled through denial of love, of fear, of all that made her mortal, and in that denial, she found immortality. The summer of 1568 brought a strange quiet to England, the kind of stillness that hides a storm. In the castles of the north, rumors moved faster than horsemen. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had crossed the border. She came not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive. Her reign in Scotland had collapsed under the weight of suspicion and tragedy. Lord Darnley, her husband, had been murdered in an explosion outside Edinburgh. Her new consort, the Earl of Bothwell, was widely believed to have arranged it. In the chaos that followed, Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son and flee toward the only refuge she could imagine, her cousin, Elizabeth Tudor. But refuge, in politics, is never mercy. Elizabeth received the news at Windsor with an expression no one could read. She had spent a lifetime being doubted, imprisoned, and judged. She knew how thin the line was between victim and threat. Mary's arrival was both gift and curse. The woman who had haunted her every decision for nearly a decade was now her prisoner, yet to touch her, to judge her, to kill her, could ignite a war across Europe. So, Elizabeth did what she had always done best. She waited. Mary was lodged at Carlisle Castle under polite arrest. The two queens exchanged letters, one pleading, one cautious, but they never met face to face. Elizabeth refused the encounter, claiming it was improper, until Mary cleared herself of the charges of conspiracy and murder. For a queen who ruled by image, Elizabeth understood the danger of reflection. To stand before Mary was to invite comparison, two queens born of rival faiths, one blessed by legitimacy in Catholic eyes, the other cursed by it. In that mirror, England might question which woman wore the true crown. And so Elizabeth kept her rival locked away, first in the north, then in the damp halls of Tutbury and Sheffield. Years would pass before Mary would ever again breathe the air without permission. While Mary's fate hung in balance, England's peace began to fracture. The arrival of the Scottish Queen rekindled every fear the Protestant realm had tried to bury, the fear of papal vengeance, of rebellion, of the old faith rising from the ashes of reform. In the winter of 1569, that fear took form. The Northern Rebellion broke out under the banners of the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland Catholic nobles, who believed Mary was the rightful queen and that Elizabeth's heresy had doomed England's soul. They gathered their retainers, raised the mass in defiance, and marched south beneath the symbol of the 5 wounds of Christ. It was the first time Elizabeth faced open revolt. Her response was not the fury of her father, but something colder. She summoned her council, summoned her army, and summoned her resolve. The rebels expected a frightened woman. They found a monarch carved of iron. Royal forces crushed the uprising. Hundreds were executed. Gallows rose in market squares, a grim forest of loyalty renewed. Elizabeth did not watch the hangings, but she knew they were necessary. Mercy was a luxury that had nearly cost her life once before. The rebellion's failure restored order but not peace. For the first time, the Pope himself moved against her. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued a bull of excommunication against Elizabeth, declaring her deposed and absolving her subjects of obedience. It was a declaration of spiritual war, a document written in Latin but understood in every language of Europe. To her enemies, it was permission to assassinate her. To her allies, it was a warning that loyalty now carried the price of damnation. Elizabeth read the bull in silence, then ordered it burned publicly in London. The flames consumed the parchment, but not the danger it carried. She knew the truth. Her survival would depend not on divine favor, but on human vigilance. In the aftermath, she turned her court into a web. No longer content to rule by charm alone, Elizabeth relied on her Secretary of State, Sir William Cecil, and his protégé, Francis Walsingham, to weave the first threads of what history would call England's Secret Service. Spies infiltrated noble houses, intercepted letters, and mapped the veins of conspiracy that ran beneath the surface of every Catholic gathering. Codes were broken, priests captured, plots revealed before they could ignite. It was a new kind of war, one fought not on battlefields but in shadows. The queen who once hesitated to trust anyone now ruled through suspicion itself. She became both sovereign and sentinel. Yet in private, she felt the cost of such vigilance. Each letter she signed, each warrant she sealed, drew her further from the world of the living. Her ladies-in-waiting saw her pacing her chambers at midnight, whispering prayers she had long since ceased to believe. Power had made her eternal in the eyes of men, but solitude had made her human in the quiet hours. In those same years, Mary Stuart endured her own transformation. From prisoner to martyr, from queen to legend, she became the rallying point for every soul who saw Elizabeth's rule as an affront to God. Smuggled letters, hidden messages, and the devotion of those who still prayed in Latin turned her captivity into crusade. Elizabeth understood that she had caged not merely a woman, but an idea, the idea that the old faith might yet reclaim its throne. And ideas, once chained, often grow wings. Still, Elizabeth refused to kill her cousin. It was not mercy that stayed her hand, but a deeper instinct. To execute a crowned queen was to fracture the divine order that held monarchies together. The moment one sovereign's blood was spilled by another, every crown in Europe would tremble. So she maintained the charade, marry the guest, marry the captive, marry the silent threat. Her counselors warned her it could not last. One day, they said, the shadow she allowed to live would rise to consume her. Elizabeth listened and did nothing, for she had learned that sometimes the greatest show of power is restraint. By the close of the decade, England stood at a crossroads between faith and fear. Its queen had survived rebellion, papal wrath, and scandal, but at a price she never confessed. The crown had given her glory and taken everything else. She was loved by her people yet surrounded by guards, celebrated as divine yet haunted by human loneliness. Robert Dudley remained at her side, his loyalty constant, his presence a reminder of the life she had once refused. The courtiers who once whispered of marriage now whispered of miracles, convinced their queen was something more than mortal. But Elizabeth knew the truth. She had traded love for legend, and now she must live with both. The Virgin Queen's vow had become her sentence. She had chosen power over peace, and in doing so became both sovereign and prisoner. For the higher a crown is raised, the lonelier the head beneath it. In the wake of rebellion and papal wrath, Elizabeth's England became a nation of watchers. Every sermon, every letter, every whisper might carry the trace of treason. The Queen had survived the open fires of revolt. Now came the invisible war of faith. Beyond the palace walls, the roads of Europe hummed with plots and counterplots. From Rome to Madrid, courtiers and cardinals drafted plans to replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. In the secret chambers of the Vatican, gold was counted, agents dispatched, promises sealed with oaths. A single murder, they believed, could deliver England back to God. Elizabeth knew all of it, not from divine inspiration, but from men who listened at doors, opened letters, and risked their souls in service of the crown. She had created, almost by instinct, a new weapon in politics, the art of surveillance. Sir Francis Walsingham, dark-eyed and tireless, became her unseen blade. His network of spies stretched from the docks of London to the alleys of Paris, from noble households to foreign courts. Codes were intercepted, ciphers broken, invisible ink revealed under candlelight. The Queen no longer needed confession. She had intelligence. It was through that web that the whispers of a new conspiracy reached Whitehall, a scheme so audacious that even her council hesitated to believe it. It was the Ridolfi plot. An Italian banker named Roberto Ridolfi, living in London under the guise of commerce, had forged a plan with the Duke of Norfolk and foreign ambassadors to overthrow Elizabeth and marry Mary Stuart to Norfolk, uniting England once more under Catholic rule. Spain would send troops, papal agents would bless the cause. The Queen would fall, quietly or by the dagger. When the plan reached Walsingham's ears, Elizabeth's crown hung by a thread. But she did not flinch. Years of fear had taught her how to read danger like scripture. She feigned ignorance, allowing her enemies to believe their secrets safe until every name was written, every promise recorded, every betrayal signed in their own hands. Then, without warning, she struck. The Duke of Norfolk was arrested, his letters seized, his confession dragged from him by the slow weight of guilt rather than torture. The conspiracy collapsed before a single sword was drawn. Ridolfi fled into exile, and Norfolk's head fell beneath the axe at the Tower. Mary Stuart was spared, but her cage grew smaller. Elizabeth's triumph was absolute, but it came without joy. Each victory against treason tightened the invisible walls around her. She was surrounded not by courtiers, but by ghosts, men and women whose loyalty she could never fully trust, whose smiles might hide daggers. To rule by fear was to live within it. The people, however, saw only the glory. In the streets of London, her image was no longer merely royal, it was holy. Artists painted her draped in pearls and suns, standing over the moon, symbols of virgin power and divine light. Ballads called her England's star, and poets dared to write of her as if she were half mortal, half miracle. This was not the Elizabeth of youth or heartbreak. This was the Shadow Queen, the monarch who ruled not through marriage or lineage, but through presence alone. Her courtiers learned to approach her like worshippers at an altar. A glance could reward, a silence could destroy. She mastered performance with the precision of a playwright. To the eye of her people, she was the living theater of England's strength. And yet behind that spectacle, she lived in constant awareness of danger. The world's greatest powers had sworn her death. The Jesuit colleges of Europe trained young priests to cross the Channel disguised as pilgrims, carrying absolution for those who would strike her down. Spain, rich with silver from the New World, plotted invasion. Even her cousin Mary, confined yet unbroken, still sent letters promising salvation for those who would deliver her from captivity. Elizabeth faced them not with armies, but with the cunning that had carried her since childhood. She had survived her father's wrath, her sister's prisons, and her own heart's betrayal. She would survive this age of knives. At court, the years between 1569 and 1571 reshaped England's soul. Her ministers, especially Cecil and Walsingham, transformed governance from ceremony to science. They catalogued every noble's loyalty, traced the flow of letters through the ports, and even mapped the spread of rumor as if it were disease. For the first time, England began to see itself not as a feudal collection of lords, but as a nation bound together by the vigilance of its queen. Religion, though, remained a battlefield. The Church of England was young, fragile, and hated by both Rome and Geneva. Elizabeth refused to lean too far toward either faith. Her settlements of 1559 stood as uneasy compromise Latin words married to Protestant sermons, crucifixes beside English prayers. She told her council, "I will not make windows into men's souls," and though the words are remembered as mercy, they were also calculation. She knew that belief could not be forced, only managed. In the shadows of that compromise, an empire of thought began to grow. Scholars at Oxford and Cambridge debated theology without fear of the stake. Printers filled London stalls with English psalms and humanist tracts. The Reformation, once a bonfire, became an industry. Even Elizabeth's enemies grudgingly admired her. In France, they called her the English Sphinx. In Spain, the Witch of the North. In her own country, Good Queen Bess. She was all of them, and none of them. But the shadow she cast stretched farther than she knew. The execution of Norfolk, though just in law, had set a precedent that no English sovereign had ever dared. The killing of a noble, not for open rebellion, but for intention. Fear became contagious. Letters were burned. Friends avoided. Words weighed before being spoken. Elizabeth's reign was now secured by obedience, not affection. And yet, she remained strangely beloved. Her people saw not the executions, but the peace that followed them. They saw not the spies, but the safety they provided. They saw not the fear, but the glory of a queen who stood alone against the might of empires and did not bow. She had become what she was always destined to be, a paradox made flesh. Her chastity made her eternal. Her suspicion made her invincible. Her isolation, her weapon. By the spring of 1571, the storm she had weathered began to subside. England's enemies were exhausted, their plots discovered before they could bloom. The realm prospered in its uneasy peace. But Elizabeth understood that peace was never permanent. It was simply the silence before the next conspiracy. She had learned that queens did not die from battles, but from betrayal. And as she stood before the mirror that spring, dressed in white and gold, her face illuminated by candlelight, she saw not a woman of 38, but the reflection of England itself, beautiful, fierce, and haunted. She ruled in daylight, but lived in shadow. Every smile was a defense, every gesture a test. For a queen who could not trust love, only fear remained loyal. The queen's court glittered like a constellation suspended above a continent in turmoil. Beneath its gold and velvet, however, the pulse of paranoia beat steady. Every jest, every glance, every favor was a calculation. In this gilded cage of ceremony, Elizabeth moved like a dancer on a knife's edge, dazzling, commanding, yet never still. After the Ridolfi plot, she no longer trusted easily. The court that once swirled with poets and gallants had become an arena of masks. Each nobleman sought to prove loyalty more fiercely than the next, offering gifts, verses, and flattery that bordered on worship. And yet, none could match the ghost of one man, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. He had returned to her side after disgrace, humbled by scandal, yet still radiant in charm. His wife's death years earlier had burned a scar into both their reputations, but time, as Elizabeth well knew, could turn even shame into myth. The court saw in their closeness something dangerous, the tension of a monarch who could not wed but could not forget. To her counselors, Dudley represented risk. To her enemies abroad, he was proof of sin. To Elizabeth, he was the reminder of everything she must never allow herself to be. She needed him, not as lover, but as mirror to reflect her power, not her weakness. And so, she kept him close. She granted him lands, honors, and the subtle cruelty of proximity, the right to stand beside her, but never to reach her. In this way, Elizabeth learned to rule hearts as she ruled nations by keeping them slightly hungry. London itself was transforming under her reign. The scars of plague and rebellion had faded into a restless prosperity. Merchants grew rich on wool and new ventures at sea. The Thames carried ships bound for Antwerp, Bordeaux, and the edges of the known world. But the Queen knew that gold was only as strong as the faith that guarded it. Her treasury still groaned under debts inherited from her father and sister. The wars in France and Scotland had drained England's coffers, and the defense against papal conspiracies demanded more coin each year. Yet Elizabeth, unlike her father, refused to bleed her realm for glory. She governed with thrift born of survival. Her gowns were patched, her palaces repaired rather than rebuilt, and every ambassador marveled that a monarch of such power could be so cautious with coin. To her, extravagance was not splendor, it was vulnerability. While she guarded her wealth, she also guarded her image with equal vigilance. The cult of the Virgin Queen began not as propaganda, but as necessity. Europe's monarchs sent suitors, princes of Austria, dukes of France, even the brother of the Spanish king. Each offered alliance, wealth, and legitimacy, the things Elizabeth was told she must possess to survive. Yet each proposal was another trap. Marriage would hand her power to a husband, and in the eyes of Europe, a queen was never equal to a king. A foreign prince would turn England into a pawn. An English noble would spark factional war, and so she declined them all. One by one, each refusal another act of political alchemy, transforming weakness into mystery. By denying every man, she became something none could control. A legend. Still, the question haunted her. Could a woman truly rule alone? In private, she studied her father's letters and her mother's fall. She knew the price of passion, the ruin of alliance, the way a crown could turn even love into execution. Anne Boleyn's blood had bought her throne. Elizabeth would not spill her own to keep it. Her virginity became her armor, a purity not of body, but of purpose. To the world, she was Gloriana, God's chosen queen. To herself, she was a survivor. The winter of 1570 brought another blow, one that struck deeper than armies. Pope Pius V issued a bull excommunicating Elizabeth and releasing her subjects from allegiance. To the Catholic world, she was now a heretic usurper. To her own people, the decree turned faith into treason. A farmer's prayer, a priest's whisper, a rosary in a pocket, all could now be proof of conspiracy. Elizabeth responded with precision, not fury. She did not seek to purge the land of Catholics as Mary had done with Protestants. Instead, she crafted laws that punished rebellion disguised as piety. Those who would worship quietly, she often ignored. Those who preached revolt, she destroyed. Her message was clear. Conscience was free. Treason was not. That distinction, narrow, pragmatic, and brutal, became the foundation of English tolerance for a century to come. Amid the fires of ideology, a colder power was rising. Intelligence. Sir Francis Walsingham's methods matured into a system that would outlive its creator. Disguised messengers, intercepted correspondence, ciphered reports. The machinery of espionage became the unseen backbone of Elizabeth's realm. In taverns along the Channel coast, sailors whispered of gold for anyone who could report a Jesuit's landing. In the halls of Cambridge, scholars debated theology by day and decoded papal letters by candlelight. England itself had become a nation of informants, bound not by creed but by vigilance. Elizabeth understood what her rivals did, not that in an age of faith, knowledge was the only true power. By the end of 1571, the storm that had begun with rebellion and ended with excommunication seemed to settle. The Queen rode through London on a crisp November day, dressed in white silk and silver armor, a living emblem of peace won through endurance. Crowds lined the streets, shouting blessings as bells rang above them. Children threw flowers, merchants bowed, and even the poor, half-starved from hard winters, found pride in her reign. To them, she was not a politician, nor even a woman. She was England itself, fierce, untouchable, eternal. She smiled, waved, and lifted her hand in blessing. But behind her jeweled sleeve, her fingers trembled, because she knew that every cheer was fleeting, every victory temporary, every peace merely the breath between storms. She had learned this lesson too young, that power was never possessed, only borrowed. That night, alone in her private chamber, Elizabeth removed her crown and sat before her mirror. The candles flickered, casting shadows across her face. The jewels that had dazzled the crowds looked colder now, like frost upon a grave. Outside, the city slept under fog, unaware that the Queen who ruled it spent her night speaking only to her reflection, to the girl who had once been a prisoner, a daughter of treason, a survivor of fires she never lit. In the mirror, that girl still looked back at her, eyes hard and bright. They both understood the same truth. A queen may conquer the world, but never herself. To rule in a world of kings, she became more than mortal. To outlive love, she made herself legend. And in the silence of her palace, she learned the cost of being eternal. By the year 1572, Elizabeth Tudor no longer ruled a fragile realm, but an awakening empire. The long years of fear and rebellion had hardened her court into something formidable, a mirror to her own soul, dazzling and dangerous. Europe watched her closely. In France, blood had flowed through the streets of Paris during the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre. Tens of thousands of Protestants lay dead, cut down in the name of faith. In Spain, Philip II's priests, blessed ships carrying silver and soldiers, the wealth of the New World, turned into weapons of divine judgment. And in the north, across the cold border of England and Scotland, there still lingered a queen who would not vanish, Mary Stuart. Her life had been a tapestry of beauty, scandal, and catastrophe. Widowed Queen of France, returned to a fractious Scotland, she had married Henry Darnley, a young man whose vanity was only matched by his recklessness. Their union, born of passion and politics, quickly rotted into contempt. In February 1567, Darnley's house exploded in Edinburgh. His body was found in the garden, unburned but strangled. Scotland recoiled. The crime was too brutal, too convenient, and too obvious. Suspicion fell upon James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, who soon married the widowed queen. To many, it was proof of guilt. To others, of madness. Rebellion erupted. Mary was captured, and by that summer, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James. But her flight south in 1568 brought the true danger, for she carried with her not just a crown lost, but a claim to another. Elizabeth received word of Mary's arrival as she dined at Greenwich. The message chilled the room. A queen had fled her throne and sought refuge from another. It was an appeal Elizabeth could neither grant nor deny. To send Mary back meant sanctioning her murder. To harbor her meant inviting rebellion from English Catholics who saw in Mary their rightful monarch. And so Elizabeth chose the only path left to her, the labyrinth of delay. Mary was taken into protective custody, her movements restricted, her letters monitored. She was a guest and a prisoner, much as Elizabeth herself had once been under Mary's sister. The symmetry did not escape her. In private, Elizabeth called her cousin the most dangerous woman in Europe. She was not wrong. Mary was a queen without a throne, a mother without a child, a woman whose beauty had become a weapon. In captivity, her allure grew mythic. To her followers, she was martyr and savior. To Elizabeth's council, she was the spark that could set England ablaze. As Mary's imprisonment lengthened, England's shadow government began to take shape. Francis Walsingham, newly returned from exile in France, saw the massacre of Huguenots as a revelation. He had witnessed how faith could justify slaughter and how information could have prevented it. He approached Elizabeth not as a courtier but as an architect of silence. Under his guidance, a network of informants stretched from Antwerp to Rome, from the ports of Kent to the backrooms of Parisian taverns. Ciphered letters crossed borders. Couriers vanished on dark roads. Wax seals hid invisible ink. To the world, Elizabeth's England was a nation of merchants and poets. To those who looked deeper, it had become a fortress built of paper, whispers, and fear. Walsingham believed in divine purpose that God had raised Elizabeth to defend true faith. His piety was cold, methodical, and lethal. For every sermon in street, Paul's, there was a shadow sermon in ink. Messages intercepted, decoded, erased. By his hand, the age of espionage was born. Elizabeth herself became a master of appearance. Her court was the theater of her rule, and she its flawless actress. She could turn a smile into policy, a glance into command. The courtiers who surrounded her, poets, soldiers, scholars, existed not to challenge her, but to reflect her brilliance. She wore white not for purity, but for power. Under torchlight, the silk shimmered like celestial armor. The jewels on her collar were chosen not for beauty, but for the story they told that England's light came from her, and her alone. Every mask, every ball, every royal progress was a performance designed to hold a nation's heart while its mind was molded by her will. Yet beneath the music and ceremony, Elizabeth's isolation deepened. The crown had become both halo and chain. She had sacrificed love for rule, and now sacrificed peace for survival. In the summer of 1572, the first great test of her espionage came. A Catholic noble named Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, England's highest peer, was implicated in a plot to marry Mary Stuart and place her on the throne. The evidence, uncovered by Walsingham's web, was undeniable. Ciphered letters, foreign gold, signatures of betrayal. Elizabeth had known Norfolk since childhood. He had dined at her table, fought under her banners, sworn loyalty to her crown. But now, he knelt before the axe on Tower Hill. The crowd that gathered that morning saw not just a traitor's death, but the end of illusion. Elizabeth's mercy had limits, and the axe had none. When the blade fell, England understood that the Virgin Queen would never hesitate again. Beyond her borders, her enemies whispered that she was heartless, faithless, unfeminine, a king in petticoats. They were right in one regard. She had become something beyond gender, beyond pity. When Walsingham asked how he should deal with foreign priests caught smuggling letters from Rome, she replied coldly, "Do as the law requires." And so, across England, gallows were raised. Catholic agents were hung, drawn, and quartered in markets and fields. Their deaths were spectacles meant not to please the Queen, but to warn her subjects. Mercy was a privilege, not a right. The terror worked. Plots still came, but fewer survived to become legend. The people prayed for her safety, not out of love alone, but out of fear for what might follow her fall. Elizabeth understood the paradox of rule, that security is built not on devotion, but on awe. By 1575, England stood transformed. The wounds of rebellion had hardened into vigilance. The merchants of London prospered. New theaters and printing houses filled the city with art and ambition. And above it all, Elizabeth reigned not as her father's daughter, but as the living image of her own invention, divine, untouchable, eternal. She was not Anne Boleyn's child, nor Henry's heir, nor Mary's rival. She was the sun itself, bright enough to blind the world to the shadow, growing just beyond her light. For in one northern castle, behind guarded walls and locked doors, Mary Stuart still breathed and waited. The letters continued to pass through hands and hearts, the ink barely dry before another cipher was written. The next storm was already forming. By the mid-1572, England lived in a strange equilibrium, a kingdom balanced between vigilance and splendor. Every sermon echoed loyalty to the crown. Every tavern whispered rumors of betrayal. Yet above this uneasy peace stood one figure untouchable and luminous: Elizabeth Regina. The court at Whitehall had become more than a palace, it was a stage. Beneath its gilded ceilings, poets, scholars, and spies performed in equal measure. Every gesture carried double meaning. Every smile could conceal a death warrant. To serve Elizabeth was to live within a play whose script only she could see. The Queen's image was now a matter of policy. Her portraits, commissioned by the hundred, presented her as both mortal and divine, her skin pale as ivory, her gown heavy with jewels that symbolized purity and power. She was painted against suns, serpents, and storms, her calm face radiating authority, untouched by time. To her subjects, she was no longer the cautious daughter of Anne Boleyn, but the living embodiment of order after chaos, the mirror of princes, as her admirers would call her. But mirrors reveal as much as they reflect. Beneath the perfection of her image lay exhaustion, the loneliness of a ruler who could trust no one completely. Robert Dudley still haunted her thoughts. His marriage to Lettice Knollys had felt like betrayal, and yet his continued devotion, his careful obedience at court, reminded her of everything she had renounced. Elizabeth had chosen her crown over love, and though her people sang her praises, the silence of her private chambers was her truest companion. Outside those chambers, a different kind of empire was being forged. Francis Walsingham, now Secretary of State, ruled over a nation of invisible men. His agents operated in Antwerp, Venice, Madrid, in inns, monasteries, and merchant ships. They intercepted letters meant for Rome, bribed couriers, copied ciphered messages, and sent them across Europe sealed with counterfeit crests. To him, loyalty was measured not in words, but in the information one could deliver. He understood that England's survival depended on secrets, and that ignorance was fatal. In his mind, Mary Stuart was not merely a prisoner, but a contagion. Every letter she sent to her followers was a spark. Every priest who crossed the Channel a match waiting to strike. By 1578, Walsingham's network had reached even into the heart of France. Through merchants and exiles, he learned of Spanish plans, papal blessings, and the restless ambitions of Philip II, the monarch who considered Elizabeth an unholy pretender to God's throne. What the Pope condemned, Walsingham prepared to answer. He trained codebreakers, mathematicians, linguists, even artists to recognize treason in ink and parchment. His men worked by candlelight in hidden rooms beneath Whitehall, translating intercepted documents from Latin, French, and Italian. Every signature that reached Elizabeth's desk had passed through a labyrinth of watchers, unseen guardians of a fragile realm. And yet, amid this machinery of fear, art began to bloom. Elizabeth's court glittered with poets and playwrights whose verses turned politics into myth. Edmund Spenser, in his Faerie Queene, cast her as Gloriana, the radiant spirit of virtue, both queen and goddess. To the common people, this image was more real than the woman herself. When Elizabeth rode through London on her royal progresses, her subjects lined the streets, showering her with petals and praise. To see her was to glimpse a divine being, an angel of peace in a century of fire. Her counselors understood the power of spectacle. They turned pageantry into propaganda. Wherever she traveled, triumphal arches and allegorical plays reminded all that England's fortune flowed from one source, her. But it was not vanity that drove this creation of myth. It was strategy. Elizabeth knew that beauty could disarm envy, and reverence could replace fear. In an age where kings ruled by birthright, she ruled by imagination. Still, beyond her borders, darker forces gathered. Spain and Rome had not abandoned their crusade. English Jesuits, trained abroad, slipped back into the kingdom disguised as merchants or scholars. Their mission was to turn hearts back to the old faith, to remind the people that obedience to the Queen was defiance against God. For Walsingham, this was war by another name. He tracked the priests through ports and manors, following trails of confession and rumor. Many were captured, tortured, and executed under the laws of treason. Elizabeth signed their warrants reluctantly, her quill trembling. "They die not for faith," she once murmured, "but for allegiance." Yet even as she said it, she knew the line was blurred beyond repair. The executions served a purpose: to remind England that survival required cruelty. Each gallows was both warning and ritual, a sacrifice to preserve the realm. In 1580, a young Jesuit named Edmund Campion was captured after months in hiding. His trial and execution struck a deep chord in England. Both sides claimed him as martyr. Walsingham saw him as proof that mercy was weakness. Elizabeth saw him as proof that even mercy could not save the innocent. The year also brought an omen from across the Atlantic: news of Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe. His triumph transformed England's mood. The seas, once symbols of distance and dread, became the frontier of destiny. Elizabeth knighted Drake aboard his ship at Deptford, laying the sword across his shoulder while Spanish ambassadors looked on in outrage. It was a message to the world. England's reach now extended beyond Europe's boundaries. And yet, for all her defiance abroad, the Queen faced her greatest danger within. By 1581, Mary Stuart had been in English custody for over a decade. She aged behind her tapestries, writing letters that would become the instruments of her ruin. Her supporters abroad still called her Queen of the English, and their plots grew bolder. Through Walsingham's spies, letters were discovered promising invasion, rebellion, and the Queen's death. Each intercepted parchment brought Elizabeth closer to a decision she dreaded, one that would stain her soul forever. Mary's captivity had become untenable. To release her was to risk rebellion. To keep her alive was to invite conspiracy. Elizabeth hesitated, torn between conscience and necessity. The years of caution that had preserved her now bound her hands. It was Walsingham who would provide the solution, not by persuasion, but by patience. He understood that her crown could not rest while another queen lived to claim it, and so he waited, weaving his web tighter with every passing month. While ministers plotted and priests perished, England entered its twilight of peace. Music filled the halls of Greenwich. Sonnets were whispered in courtyards. Courtiers danced in elaborate rituals of devotion. The Queen's face, illuminated by candlelight, had become a symbol more powerful than any army. But she was no longer the young woman who had defied Parliament's demands for marriage or silenced her bishops with wit. The years had carved endurance into her, and the fire that once sought love now burned only for legacy. Robert Dudley's laughter no longer echoed through the halls. His wife, Lettice, had been banished. His health began to fail. Elizabeth saw in him a mirror of her own mortality, the fading of those who had known her when she was merely a girl in exile. Her crown gleamed brighter than ever, but its weight had grown unbearable. In the closing months of 1583, as winter descended on London, Walsingham placed a sealed packet upon the Queen's desk. Within it lay the final proof of a plot that would shatter the fragile balance of her reign. For 10 years, he had hunted whispers and shadows. Now, the trap was ready. The letters bore Mary's ciphered hand, her approval of a scheme to end Elizabeth's life and place herself upon the throne with Spanish aid. The Queen stared at the ink, her face unreadable. Outside, the bells of Westminster tolled for evening prayer. She said nothing, but in that silence, the age of mercy died and the age of Gloriana began. By the winter of 1584, England's heart beat in quiet dread. The peace that had followed a decade of vigilance began to tremble beneath the weight of conspiracy. In candlelit corridors and coded letters, the fate of two queens drew inexorably together. Mary Stuart's imprisonment had stretched into 19 years. Age and confinement had dulled her beauty, but not her resolve. From her rooms in Staffordshire, she still wrote in elegant French, her words wrapped in code and carried by couriers who risked their lives for a dream: the restoration of a Catholic crown upon England's throne. Francis Walsingham, ever watchful, had tightened his web. His spies worked in taverns, convents, and embassies, trailing every rumor that crossed the Channel. And in the summer of that year, the first whispers of the final plot began to reach him. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic noble with more passion than prudence, had written to Mary a letter promising deliverance, rebellion, and murder. He vowed that England's queen would soon fall, and her cousin would reign in her stead. Walsingham's men intercepted the message before it reached its destination. With cold precision, they allowed the correspondence to continue, feeding it through a double agent who carried Mary's responses back to London. Every word, every cipher, every secret was now in their hands. The trap had been set not with swords, but with ink. While Walsingham's shadow war unfolded, the Queen above ground lived in a paradox of majesty and melancholy. Elizabeth's reign had entered its golden years. Her navy ruled the seas. Her poets turned her into myth. And yet within her private chambers, a haunting presence lingered, the man who had stood beside her since the beginning. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, had returned to court after years of estrangement. His hair was graying, his step less sure, but his devotion remained undimmed. To see him again was to recall the bright mornings of youth, the laughter before politics, the brief illusion that she might have been simply a woman and not a sovereign. He bowed before her, and for a fleeting instant, the court held its breath, the two halves of England's legend reunited. But the moment was fragile. The Queen's affection for him was shadowed by years of scandal and rumor, by the ghost of his dead wife, by the endless duties that bound her heart in gold and iron. She had long since learned that love, for her, could only exist in memory. When he left her presence, she said softly, "He is my eyes." Those who heard it understood he saw for her what she could no longer bear to see, the loneliness of power. The realm, however, saw something else entirely. Across Europe, crowns turned against her. In 1585, King Philip II of Spain, the same monarch once offered as her suitor, declared war. The cold hostility of decades now became open defiance. His fleets gathered in Iberian harbors, his generals spoke of divine conquest, and his priests preached the holy cleansing of England's heresy. Elizabeth responded not with panic, but with calculation. She sent aid to the Dutch rebels fighting Spanish rule, financing their war with English gold and promises of alliance. She authorized privateers like Francis Drake to strike at Spain's ships across the Atlantic, piracy, cloaked in patriotism. Drake's raids in the Caribbean and Cadiz humiliated Philip, burning his ships and stealing his treasure. But for every Spanish galleon lost, the king ordered 2 more built. The Queen's council knew what was coming. An armada of faith and fury, built to erase her reign and her name. As England braced for invasion, Walsingham delivered his masterstroke. In August 1586, the letters between Mary Stuart and Babington were complete. In her own hand, Mary had endorsed the plan to assassinate Elizabeth, a single signature sealing her doom. Walsingham brought the evidence to the Queen's chamber. The parchment lay before her like a relic of betrayal. For a long time, Elizabeth said nothing. She traced her fingers along the ink, as if trying to touch the woman she had once pitied, the cousin who had sought refuge and found a cage. "God help us both," she murmured, and signed the warrant for Mary's arrest. What followed was not swift. Elizabeth hesitated for months, torn between justice and conscience. She knew what it meant to be a queen imprisoned by politics, a woman condemned by men who feared her. She had lived that terror herself. But her counsel pressed her relentlessly. Walsingham argued that England's safety could no longer rest upon mercy. Parliament clamored for execution. The people demanded it as retribution for years of plots and fear. And so, with trembling hand, Elizabeth signed again, this time upon the warrant that would end her cousin's life. On a February morning in 1587, in the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, Mary Stuart mounted the scaffold. She wore scarlet beneath her black gown, the color of martyrdom. Her last words were prayers for her son and for the forgiveness of those who condemned her. When the axe fell, England exhaled and the Queen collapsed in tears. She had not wanted it, not truly. For all their rivalry, she saw in Mary a reflection of herself, a woman crushed by crowns, betrayed by men, defined by history rather than desire. News of the execution spread like wildfire through Europe. In Catholic courts, it was denounced as murder. In Protestant pulpits, it was celebrated as divine judgment. For Elizabeth, it was neither. It was the price of survival, the last toll of a bell that had been ringing since her birth. Robert Dudley understood her grief in silence. He too had known what it meant to kill for necessity. As commander of English forces in the Netherlands, he had seen rebellion, betrayal, and death. He had served her faithfully even when banished from her favor. But his body was failing. The years of campaign, the burden of loyalty, and the quiet ache of unfulfilled love had drained him. In the autumn of 1588, as storm clouds gathered over the Channel, he fell ill while traveling to join the army at Tilbury. The force assembled to defend England against the oncoming Spanish Armada. From his bed, he wrote one final letter to Elizabeth. It was simple, tender, and unguarded. He signed it, "Your loving servant." She kept it in a box beside her bed for the rest of her life. When news of his death reached her, the court fell silent. For 3 days, she did not eat, nor speak to anyone. She locked herself away and emerged only once, her face pale, her eyes hollow, her spirit armored once more. She wore mourning for no one else, but for him, she did. Outside the palace walls, the greatest threat England had ever faced loomed across the sea. From the harbors of Lisbon, the Spanish Armada had sailed 130 ships, armed with 20,000 soldiers and blessed by the Pope himself. Their banners bore the cross of Christ. Their mission was holy war. Elizabeth's fate, and the fate of her nation, would now be decided not by council or courtship, but by wind and fire. And though she stood utterly alone, the ghost of love, the memory of Robert Dudley, still walked beside her, unseen but unforgotten, as England prepared to meet its reckoning. In the summer of 1588, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. Across Europe, the air trembled with prophecy. Priests in Madrid blessed the fleet that would carry God's vengeance to England's shores. Bishops in London called their congregations to prayer. Every wind that stirred the Channel smelled of salt and smoke and destiny. The Spanish Armada, a crescent of floating fortresses, had set sail from Lisbon in May. It was the mightiest fleet ever assembled. 130 ships, 20,000 soldiers, nearly 3,000 cannon, and the faith of a king who believed himself chosen by heaven. Philip II called it La Empresa de Inglaterra, the English enterprise. Its purpose was simple: to crush the heretic queen and restore Catholic rule to the island that had defied Rome. Elizabeth's counselors begged her to hide behind the walls of London. Instead, she chose to face the storm head-on. In early July, the Armada appeared off Cornwall. Church bells rang in alarm, beacons flared to life along the coast, one after another, a chain of fire stretching across England, warning that the enemy had come. From Plymouth, the English fleet sailed to meet them. Smaller, faster, deadlier. Their captains were not nobles, but sailors hardened by years of private war. Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, men who had learned to read the sea like scripture. The English ships harried the Spanish line, striking at its edges and vanishing into fog. Their guns fired faster. Their helms turned quicker. It was not a battle of brute strength, but of skill, and the sea favored those who understood its moods. Elizabeth followed the reports from Greenwich with unshaken calm. "God's winds will fight for us," she said, and the winds obeyed. At the mouth of the Channel, the Armada anchored near Calais to await its army from the Netherlands. It was here that Drake made his most daring move. Under cover of night, he ordered 8 ships set aflame and sent them drifting toward the Spanish line. The fireships, loaded with pitch and powder, floated silently until the wind carried them into the enemy's midst. Then came chaos. The Spanish captains cut their anchors to escape the flames, breaking formation. In the confusion, their fleet scattered, and at dawn, the English struck. Off Gravelines, the two navies clashed in the battle that would decide Europe's fate. Cannon thunder rolled across the waves. The English ships darted in and out of range, tearing through Spanish hulls with relentless precision. Smoke and flame turned the morning sky into a painting of judgment. When the fighting ended, the Channel was littered with wreckage and bodies. The once proud Armada limped north, its commanders praying for safe harbor. But heaven had made its choice. Storms swept down from the Atlantic, relentless and divine. The Spanish ships, driven by wind and terror, fled around Scotland and Ireland, where the rocks waited like executioners. One by one they shattered against the coasts, their crews drowned or captured. By the time the survivors crawled back to Spain, More than half the fleet was gone. Philip II received the news in silence. "I sent my ships to fight men, not the elements," he said. England, against all odds, had endured. At Tilbury, on the banks of the Thames, the army that had awaited invasion stood ready. Soldiers, farmers, and nobles gathered in the mud, expecting their queen to remain safely behind the capital's walls. Instead, Elizabeth appeared on horseback, clad in silver armor that caught the morning light. She rode among her men, her red hair blazing beneath the open sky, her voice carrying across the ranks. She spoke not as monarch, but as England itself, frail in body, unbreakable in spirit. Her words needed no record. It was enough that they were spoken. In that moment, she became more than a ruler. She was defiance made flesh, the embodiment of a people who had stood against the greatest empire on earth and prevailed. The soldiers cheered until the sound drowned out the river's flow. When the Armada's defeat was confirmed, London erupted in celebration. Bells rang for days. Bonfires burned through the night. Poets wrote verses proclaiming her God's chosen. Painters immortalized her as a goddess crowned with victory. But within the palace, the Queen mourned quietly. Robert Dudley's death still shadowed her joy. His letter, the one signed "Your loving servant," lay in her chamber. Its ink faded but not forgotten. She kept it beside her prayer book, a relic of the life she might have had. Victory had made her eternal in the eyes of her people. But immortality was a lonely reward. She walked through the silent halls of Richmond and felt the weight of ghosts. Her youth had gone with him. Her heart was now bound to the realm alone. Beyond her walls, England entered an age of light and legend. The poets called her Gloriana, the radiant queen whose reign had turned fear into empire. Explorers carried her banner to the ends of the world. Preachers called her triumph, proof of divine favor. The storm that had scattered Spain became the wind that filled England's sails. Elizabeth understood what few monarchs ever did: that power, to endure, must be transformed into story. She shaped her image as carefully as a sculptor shapes marble, every speech, every appearance, every gesture reinforcing the illusion of divinity. To her people, she was not merely queen but destiny itself, the woman who had faced the world's wrath and emerged untouched. And yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would still take the old letter from its box and trace the faded signature. It was all that remained of the girl who had once believed she could love and still rule. The victory over Spain had made her a legend, but legends cannot grieve nor grow old. Elizabeth had won her immortality, and in doing so, had buried the last fragments of her heart beneath the crown. The Virgin Queen, the living myth, stood at the height of glory, even as the light behind her eyes began, imperceptibly, to fade. The storm that broke the Armada did not fade. It changed direction. It became wind in England's sails, fire in her soul, and faith in her future. From the ashes of invasion rose something greater than defense ambition. The island that had once feared conquest began to dream of conquest itself. Elizabeth had not only survived, she had transcended. The queen who once trembled in the Tower now ruled in England, baptized by victory. The people called her Gloriana, the goddess in armor who had tamed both tyrants and tempests. Painters covered her face in gold leaf. Poets compared her to Estrella, the Virgin of Justice returned from heaven. Every portrait was a prayer, every word an act of worship. Yet behind the myth stood a woman aging, alone, and more aware than ever that her life story had become her country's scripture. The court had changed with the times. Robert Dudley's death had left a void no advisor could fill. Around her gathered men who sought not affection but opportunity. Francis Walsingham's network of spies, William Cecil's cautious hand, Walter Raleigh's restless ambition. Each played his part in shaping the image of a queen who was both untouchable and omnipresent. A monarch turned symbol, a symbol turned miracle. Elizabeth understood it perfectly. She had learned long ago that survival was not merely endurance, but performance. In the years that followed the Armada, England became a nation of sails and steel. The ocean, once a boundary, now became a promise. The captains who had harried Spain turned their prows westward. Francis Drake, restless as ever, sought new riches across the Atlantic. Walter Raleigh claimed lands in the New World, naming them Virginia, a tribute to the Queen whose chastity had become a political weapon. Ships returned with strange treasures, gold from Spanish galleons, tobacco from the Americas, tales of endless forests and unknown seas. Every success fed the legend of Elizabeth's reign as a golden age, the dawn of empire. But empire was never born from glory alone. It was built on faith and fire. The Church of England, once fragile and uncertain, hardened into national creed. Victory over Spain was preached as divine proof. God had chosen England as his instrument. Ministers thundered from pulpits that Protestantism was the true light of Christendom, and Elizabeth its guardian. The Queen encouraged it subtly. She never declared herself saint or savior, yet she permitted others to see her as both. Her image was hung in cathedrals, her initials carved into altars. Her coronation portrait was reproduced endlessly, the serene face, the calm eyes, the hand resting upon the globe. To her subjects, she was no longer merely human. She was England's covenant made flesh. And yet, the woman beneath the crown still bled. At court, the dances continued. Masks and pageants filled the halls, celebrating peace and prosperity. But for Elizabeth, each performance was also a mask. Behind the jewels, she felt the slow erosion of time. Her red hair, once aflame, now required wigs of spun gold. Her pale skin, once radiant, demanded the disguise of white lead. The mirror, once her ally, had become her adversary. She did not allow anyone to see the change. For a queen whose image ruled the world, decay was treason. The poet saw only the myth. Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen crowned her as Gloriana, the radiant monarch of virtue and majesty. Courtiers bowed lower, artists painted softer halos, and the English people began to believe their queen was more than mortal. But within her chamber, late at night, she sometimes opened the letter Robert Dudley had written before his death, the one she still called my last comfort. She would trace the fading ink and whisper his name, not aloud, but in thought. The world outside sang of divine providence and empire. Inside, she remembered the warmth of a human hand. In 1590, news reached London of Drake's final voyage. The sea, which had carried him to glory, now took him to his grave. He died off the coast of Panama, buried at sea, wrapped in lead, his body sinking into the deep he had once conquered. Elizabeth received the tidings in silence. Another of her champions was gone, swallowed by the same element that had made them both eternal. Her victories had given England a new identity, fearless, proud, unyielding, but they had also taken from her every man she had ever loved or trusted. Dudley, Walsingham, Drake, names that now lived only in memory and in the songs sung by sailors as they gazed westward. She ruled a realm built on absence. The Spanish threat was not truly gone. Spain rebuilt its fleets, its priests preached vengeance, and Catholic exiles plotted in the shadows. But England had changed too. It no longer trembled at foreign powers. It inspired them. Explorers spoke of new colonies, traders built fortunes, and English ships roamed seas once forbidden. The Queen's image, calm, watchful, resplendent, was carried aboard every vessel like a charm against disaster. Her face became the compass of an age. Yet the greater her legend grew, the smaller her private world became. The courtiers who surrounded her treated her like a relic, half divine, half untouchable. Few dared speak to her as they once did. Those who remembered the laughter of her youth were dead or dying. The court she had built as a living theater was becoming a mausoleum of masks. Still, Elizabeth endured. She had weathered assassination plots, invasions, betrayals, and heartbreak. The years had honed her into something harder than any crown, a monarch who ruled not by force but by the sheer gravity of will. The nation looked to her not just for leadership but for meaning. In an uncertain world, she was the constant. In an age of faith, she was the proof that God favored England. She carried that burden with the grace of ritual and the discipline of solitude. Her power was not born of passion but of restraint, not of miracles but of memory. And as the 1,590 seconds dawned, her empire stretched farther than any English ruler before her could have dreamed. Yet the fire that had built it, the fire of faith, the fire of love, the fire of defiance still burned behind her eyes. For all her divinity, she remained human enough to fear the dark. In the years after 1590, England glowed with a strange, golden light, half glory, half illusion. The court poets called it the Age of Elizabeth, as though history itself had taken her name. But even the brightest dawn, if stared at too long, blinds the eye. Beyond London's theatres and palaces, the countryside changed. Roads widened, markets swelled, literacy spread. The plague that had once silenced villages now visited them less often, but hunger still lingered. The merchants of London built their fortunes on spices and silk, on sugar and slave ships, while laborers in Kent still fought for bread. Yet the illusion of prosperity was powerful, the image of an island chosen by God, rising from obscurity into empire. At the center of that vision stood one figure, steady as the pole star, Elizabeth Regina. She ruled not by decree but by presence. Her progresses through the shires were pilgrimages. Towns cleaned their streets and covered their walls with garlands as her carriage approached. She appeared radiant, untouched by age, though beneath the makeup, time's hand had already begun its quiet work. Every movement was calculated, every gesture sacred. She had learned long ago that a queen's body was no longer her own. It was the mirror in which her nation saw itself. Her court became a theater of devotion. Courtiers competed for her favor, as if for sunlight. Their words rehearsed, their glances choreographed. They called her the sun, and they revolved around her accordingly. Raleigh wrote verses of worship thinly disguised as poetry. Essex fought for glory in Ireland, his pride both armor and curse. They loved her as one loves a star, distant, radiant, unattainable. But love, to Elizabeth, had long ceased to be a gift. It was currency, weapon, and mask. The heart that once beat for Robert Dudley had been replaced by an iron rhythm, the pulse of the crown itself. To show affection was to reveal weakness. To grieve was to remind the world she was mortal. She permitted herself neither. Yet solitude was not silence. In the long winter evenings, when the courtiers had withdrawn and the candles burned low, she would summon her musicians and sit alone as the lutes played the old songs. Melancholy had become her companion, a quiet shadow beside the throne. In 1591, Walter Raleigh, her boldest courtier, the restless sailor she once favored, secretly married one of her maids. When she learned of it, her fury shook the court. It was not love that fueled her wrath, but betrayal of image. Her courtiers were to belong to the crown, not to themselves. The illusion of her virgin majesty could tolerate no rivals, not even private affection among those who served her. Raleigh was sent to the Tower, his ambitions broken but not extinguished. In the years to come, he would write poetry of exile and longing, not for love, but for the Queen's lost grace. To rule was to be alone. To be loved was to be betrayed. Elizabeth understood both truths too well. Meanwhile, the flames of faith continued to consume Europe. The Reformation had not ended with the Armada's defeat. Across the Channel, France bled through its own wars of religion. In the Low Countries, Protestants and Catholics tore cities apart in the name of heaven. Elizabeth's England watched and waited. She became the cautious arbiter of Europe's chaos, balancing aid and diplomacy like weights upon a scale. Her spies worked in Antwerp and Rome, her ambassadors in Madrid and Paris. Each dispatch carried the same silent message. England would remain unbroken, its queen unbowed. Francis Walsingham, the architect of her secret world, was gone dead in 1590, but his web remained. No whisper escaped the court's walls. No rumor crossed the Channel without her knowing. Her survival had always depended on knowledge. Now it ensured her supremacy. At home, her people began to see her less as woman and more as idea. The Virgin Queen was no longer a political fiction but a national religion. Sermons praised her as God's chosen vessel. Plays at the Globe drew parallels between her and celestial goddesses. Even the poets who grieved the passing of youth and time framed her age as proof of divine endurance. To live under Elizabeth was to live under myth. And yet myths cannot feel the cold. By the mid-1592s, the Queen's health began to falter. Her appetite waned. Her nights grew longer. The death of old friends Cecil, Leicester, Walsingham had hollowed her circle until it was little more than memory. In her private chambers, she surrounded herself with relics of her past. letters tied with ribbons, miniatures of the young men who had once knelt at her feet, a portrait of her mother, Anne Boleyn, the woman whose shadow she had spent her entire life escaping. Sometimes she would look at that face, the dark eyes and the knowing smile, and wonder whether the world had truly changed since that day on the scaffold. Both mother and daughter had been defined by the same thing: power borrowed from love, and love destroyed by power. Outside, London thrived. The theaters of Shakespeare filled the air with words that danced like fire. His history plays whispered that England itself was a stage, its kings and queens merely actors. Elizabeth understood the message, and she embraced it. If she was to be an actor, she would play her part perfectly until the curtain fell. Her speeches, once spontaneous, now became ritual. Her public appearances, rarer and more solemn. She wore heavier jewels, higher collars, grander gowns as though to shield herself from time. Each year, her portraits grew more stylized, her face smoother, her features ethereal. The woman was fading, but the image endured. She was becoming an idea even to herself. When the Spanish launched a second armada in 1596, the storms rose again. The fleet scattered before it ever reached English shores, and the nation hailed the weather as divine favor once more. God, it seemed, still kept his covenant with Gloriana. But Elizabeth knew that every storm, no matter how fierce, must eventually pass, and when it does, silence follows. In that silence, she found her own reflection. Her life had become the mirror of England's soul, brilliant, proud, and profoundly alone. The empire was taking shape beyond her sight, across oceans and deserts, but she herself was receding from the world she had made. Her reign had begun with danger and passion. It now drifted towards stillness and myth. The courtiers still cheered her name. The poets still praised her grace. But the sound no longer reached her heart. The woman who had ruled through fire and faith now sat surrounded by the echoes of her own legend, a living monument to an age that was already beginning to fade. And as the candles burned low in Whitehall, the Virgin Queen, England's brightest flame, stared into the darkness and understood what she had always known, that every empire, even one born of faith and fire, must eventually burn itself into memory. Winter settled early over England that year, and it never seemed to leave. The winds off the Thames grew colder, sharper, and the sun lingered shorter in the sky. Within the halls of Whitehall, where once there had been laughter and dance, now lingered silence, the slow, echoing kind that clings to great buildings after their music has died. The Virgin Queen was aging, and so was her court. The golden tapestries still gleamed, but their colors had dulled. The courtiers still bowed, but their eyes watched her not with awe, but calculation. The queen who had once commanded the hearts of her nation now ruled by the weight of habit, an icon revered, but no longer feared. Elizabeth had built her reign on illusion, the illusion of youth, of control, of eternal glory. But illusions, no matter how radiant, demand a price. Her hair was now a crown of wigs, her face a mask of white paint that cracked under candlelight. The jewels around her neck glittered like frozen stars, beautiful but cold, yet her gaze still carried the old fire. Beneath the powder and lace, the steel remained. The courtiers whispered that she no longer slept, that she walked her chambers through the night, speaking softly to ghosts. Some said she murmured Dudley's name. Others swore she conversed with herself, as though testing the sound of her own fading legend. The death of William Cecil in 1598 marked the end of an age. Her faithful counselor, her compass in all storms, had served her since her youth. When the news reached her, she locked herself away and would see no one. For a queen who trusted few, losing one of the few she could trust was like losing part of her crown. His son, Robert Cecil, inherited the role, but not the closeness. He was brilliant, cunning, and watchful, a spider weaving webs of diplomacy in a changing world. Elizabeth needed him, but she did not love him. Love had long been a word without meaning in her court. It was power, not affection, that now held the kingdom together. But power was slipping. The Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, rose like a star in her final decade. He was young, proud, reckless, and for a time, her new favorite. He flattered her vanity, called her his phoenix, and dared to look upon her not as goddess, but woman. He reminded her of Dudley, the same charm, the same danger. Elizabeth indulged him, perhaps because he made her remember what it felt like to be seen. But Essex was not made for loyalty, he was made for fire. In 1596, he led an English fleet to Spain and returned in triumph. He was crowned in praise, his name sung through London's taverns. But triumphs turned quickly to temptations. Essex began to believe that he, not Elizabeth, was the true savior of England. She saw it in his eyes, the same look she had seen in men before they fell. Their friendship became a duel of pride. Essex spoke too freely, argued too boldly. Once, in council, he turned his back on her, an unforgivable insult. Elizabeth struck him across the face, and he left the chamber in fury. It was a small act, but in the theater of monarchy, gestures are weapons. The blow that echoed through the court was not of flesh, but of authority. It was the moment when affection finally surrendered to power. The years that followed were a study in decline. England, once united in victory, began to splinter. Famine struck the north. Ireland burned in rebellion. War with Spain dragged on, consuming gold and lives alike. The Queen's coffers emptied, her energy drained. She sat longer in silence now during council meetings, her hand trembling when she signed decrees. The courtiers bowed lower, but their eyes wandered elsewhere, toward the future, toward James of Scotland, toward whatever would come after her. They no longer saw a living monarch. They saw a closing chapter. In 1599, Elizabeth sent Essex to Ireland to crush the uprising led by Hugh O'Neill. He went unwillingly, knowing it was both command and exile. What followed was disaster. His army faltered. His pride refused surrender. Without permission, he signed a truce with the enemy, a direct affront to the Queen's will. Then, in an act of sheer desperation, he abandoned his post and rode for London, mud-splattered, weary, and defiant. He burst into her private chambers at Nonsuch Palace, unannounced, a crime no man would dare. The sight shocked the court. The Virgin Queen, unadorned, stood before him not as Gloriana, but as a woman betrayed. No words of reconciliation followed. The gulf between them had become too wide. Essex was dismissed, confined to house arrest, and stripped of command. In his fury, he began to plot. The following winter, London whispered of rebellion. Essex's pride had turned to ambition, his frustration to treason. He gathered followers, nobles, soldiers, men disillusioned by the old Queen's fading star. On a cold February morning in 1601, he marched his small force into the city, hoping the people would rise to join him. None did. The gates of Whitehall remained closed. The Queen's loyal guard surrounded the rebels before nightfall. Essex was captured and brought to trial. When he confessed, his voice broke not from guilt, but disbelief that she had truly turned against him. But Elizabeth had no choice. To spare him would be to admit weakness. To execute him was to kill the last echo of her youth. She signed his death warrant with a trembling hand. On February 25th, the axe fell. The man who had called her Phoenix was gone, leaving behind ashes that even she could not reignite. Afterward, she withdrew into herself completely. Whitehall, once a living court, became a tomb of memory. The laughter of masks and music ceased. Even the candles seemed to burn lower. She walked the corridors alone, touching the tapestries, as if to reassure herself that she still existed. In her bedchamber, she kept his ring, the one Essex had sent before his execution, begging for mercy that never came. They found it later in her box of relics, beside Dudley's letter. Two men, two ghosts, two fragments of the heart she had buried beneath her crown. The world outside still called her Gloriana, but inside those walls she was simply Elizabeth, tired, mortal, and surrounded by ghosts. Her body ached, her mind wandered, and her reflection no longer resembled the portraits that hung in her halls. Yet when she stood before her council, she straightened her back, her voice steady as ever. No one dared speak of her weakness. No one dared look at her too long. She had ruled through storms, through wars, through the passing of generations. But now, as winter deepened, she ruled only through the force of memory, her nation's and her own. The Queen, who had turned faith into empire, now lived within the ruins of her own mythology. And in those final winters of her reign, England learned what happens when a sun begins to set, not suddenly, but slowly, stretching its light across the horizon one last time before the dark. After the scaffold fell silent, the court changed. Men who had once cheered Essex now kept their eyes down. His allies melted into exile or submission, leaving behind a vacuum no one dared to fill. The Queen's will had triumphed again, but it was a hollow victory. England stood calm on the surface, but beneath it the tide had shifted. A new generation whispered in corridors and counting houses. They were born after the Spanish Armada, raised in an England that had never known anything but Elizabeth's rule. To them, she was not the living flame she once had been, but a figure carved in gold, radiant but distant. And like all idols, she began to feel the chill of her own pedestal. She withdrew further from the world. At Richmond Palace, her court became a ghostly shadow of its former self. The musicians who once filled her nights with song now played for empty air. The courtiers who had once jostled for her smile now avoided her gaze. They feared what they saw there, the deep, unblinking eyes of a monarch who had outlived everyone she ever loved. Her steps grew slower. The gout tormented her. Sleep fled. Servants found her standing by the window before dawn, her figure outlined by frost. Sometimes she spoke softly to the river below the same Thames that had carried her to coronation 40 years earlier, and would one day carry her coffin to Westminster. In those final years, Elizabeth seemed to float between worlds. She would sit for hours without speaking, hands folded in her lap, staring at the empty chair beside her. When counselors approached, she turned to them with sudden sharpness, her mind still keen, her temper unsoftened, but she could no longer bear the sound of music. The dances that once defined her court, the pavans, galliards, and masks, ceased altogether. "She will not hear the viols," one lady-in-waiting recorded. "The Queen's heart is heavy with remembrance." Even her beloved palaces began to die around her. The gardens at Nonsuch fell untended. The tapestries at Whitehall gathered dust. The court that had once embodied the spirit of the Renaissance now decayed like an old cathedral, grand but hollow. She never forgot the ring. When word came that Essex had begged for his life and that she had never received the message, she said nothing. But they saw her eyes, that sudden flicker of grief, too brief for tears, too deep for forgiveness. Some said she wore black for a year after his death. Others claimed she refused to wear color ever again. Her silence became legend. The England she ruled was changing beneath her feet. Trade with the New World brought wealth, but also new ambition. The poets and explorers who once sang her praises, Raleigh, Drake, Spencer, were gone, imprisoned or dead. The noble families that once feared her now awaited her passing. Even the church, which had crowned her supreme governor, whispered prayers for her successor. They all looked north, toward the King of Scots. Robert Cecil, the last of her great ministers, negotiated in secret with James VI. He did it not out of betrayal, but necessity. England needed a smooth succession, and Elizabeth, though she would never admit it, knew it too. But she would not speak the name of her heir. To do so was to accept that her reign and her world were ending. By 1601, she appeared rarely in public. When she did, she was still magnificent, jeweled, pale, and shimmering beneath the candlelight. But her movements were slow, deliberate, ritualistic. Every gesture had the gravity of farewell. At a royal procession in early spring, the crowd cheered as she passed, their voices rising like a tide of gratitude and grief. But those closest to the carriage saw the truth. Her hands trembled, her eyes watered not from joy, but exhaustion. For 45 years she had carried a crown that weighed more than any sword. Now it bent her shoulders and hollowed her breath. Her ladies-in-waiting, many of whom had grown old beside her, began to weep quietly when they thought she could not hear. But Elizabeth did not want comfort. When her council begged her to rest, she refused. "A monarch does not rest," she said once, "for sleep belongs to the innocent." And innocence had long since left her. By the winter of 1602, she could no longer eat. The physicians prescribed sweet cordials, warm wines, prayers. She ignored them all. Her bed stood untouched. She slept on the floor, wrapped in cushions and shawls, as though afraid that to lie down was to surrender. Those who saw her said she seemed both ancient and ageless, her body frail, her eyes sharp as ever. The ladies took turns watching her, afraid she might vanish while they blinked. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were measured like the tolling of a bell. "My seat has been a seat of kings," she murmured once. "Who shall sit upon it when I am gone?" No one dared to answer. She spent her last days at Richmond, the same palace where she had once danced in triumph after the Armada. Now the rooms were cold, the curtains drawn, the courtiers gathered in anxious silence outside her chamber door. Inside, the queen refused to rest, pacing the floor as she had done her entire life, restless, unyielding, afraid of stillness. When her strength finally failed, she sank into her cushions and closed her eyes. It was then, they said, that she spoke her last clear words, "I am tired." After that, her voice faded into whispers. Robert Cecil stood by her side as the candlelight flickered. There were no speeches, no ceremony, no final command, only the sound of the river outside, flowing endlessly toward the sea. On the morning of March 24th, 1603, the Virgin Queen was gone. The news spread like thunder. In London, church bells tolled for hours. People wept openly in the streets. To many, it was as though the sun itself had gone out. Elizabeth had ruled longer than any monarch in English memory, longer than most of her subjects had lived. Under her, England had changed from a fragile kingdom into a power that would shape the world. She left no child, no heir of her body, only a nation reborn in her image. Her coffin was carried down the Thames to Westminster, draped in black velvet and crowned with her scepter. Thousands lined the riverbanks, silent beneath the grey sky. As the oars cut through the water, the bells of every church in London rang together, not in mourning, but in reverence. And so ended the reign of Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Anne Boleyn, survivor of the Tower, mistress of an empire, and the last monarch of her line. History would call her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the Fairy Queen. But beneath the titles and the myths, she remained what she had always been, a woman forged by loneliness and love, who ruled because she could not trust the world to rule her. Her crown was her shield, her solitude, her strength. And when her long reign finally set, the age of chivalry and faith gave way to the age of empire born from her fire, carried by her shadow. The crown of England had never known silence until now. When Elizabeth Tudor died, the sound of bells rolled across the realm like thunder receding over a far sea. In London, the merchants shuttered their windows. The apprentices who had once shouted, "God save the Queen," fell quiet. The same river that had carried her coronation barge in glory now bore her coffin in grief. It was the end of a dynasty and the beginning of a legend. Her reign had lasted 45 years, longer than many lives, longer than the memory of war or famine or foreign rule. In her time, England had risen from the chaos of Henry's 6 marriages and Mary's fires into an empire of faith, letters, and sea. Under her, the English tongue itself had transformed from the language of the island to the language of the world. Yet in her final days, she was alone. The courtiers who once called her Majesty whispered prayers for the coming king. The children of those who had danced at her coronation now stood in her halls as gray men. And where once her court had gleamed with gold, pearls, and poets, there was only the sound of a tired queen's breath and the faint ticking of a clock. When they opened the chamber at Richmond after her passing, they found on her table a small mirror, clouded by candle smoke. She had not allowed anyone to remove it. For a woman who had lived by image, who had ruled through spectacle, the mirror was both her greatest ally and her cruelest judge. In her youth, it had reflected the most dazzling figure in Europe, a queen of fire and wit. In her final days, it showed the truth that no monarch could escape. Even Gloriana must fade. Those who tended her body said she seemed smaller than they remembered, delicate, almost fragile. Yet her face, even in death, held the faintest trace of a smile. Some said it was pride, others, peace. The courtiers moved carefully around the question of succession. Robert Cecil, the last of her great ministers, had prepared for this moment in secret. He had spent years negotiating with James VI of Scotland, knowing that the survival of England depended on a bloodless transition. It was a strange irony. The Virgin Queen's last political act would be to yield her crown to the son of her executed rival, Mary Stuart. No one dared to speak it aloud while she lived, but when the pulse stopped, The words passed quietly from chamber to chamber. The King of Scots is now King of England. The Tudor sun had set. A Stuart dawn began to rise. Yet, for all the careful planning, no one was prepared for the grief that followed. When the news reached London, crowds gathered outside the palace gates. Men and women knelt in the mud, crossing themselves. Some prayed for her soul. Others simply stared at the gray sky, as though waiting for her to appear in it one last time. The chroniclers wrote that the air itself seemed changed, that the city's pulse slowed, the sound of the streets softened. After 45 years of certainty, England felt suddenly leaderless, as if the ground beneath its feet had shifted. Her funeral was the grandest the kingdom had ever seen. 1,000 soldiers lined the procession route. The coffin was draped in black velvet, topped with her crown and orb. Atop it rested an effigy of the queen, lifelike and radiant, wearing a gown of white satin, her hair loose about her shoulders, her hand extended as if in eternal benediction. The people knelt as the cortege passed. Some wept openly, others simply whispered, "She is gone." The bells of every church rang in unison. The horses' hooves echoed off the stones like a heartbeat fading away. The coffin moved from Richmond to Whitehall, and then, finally, to Westminster Abbey. There she was, laid beside her half-sister Mary, two queens divided by faith, united at last by history. Above her tomb they carved an epitaph in Latin: "Consorts in throne and tomb, we sisters rest together here. One in the faith, one in hope." But it was the inscription added later that captured her truth best. "Here lies Elizabeth, who reigned over England, Ireland, and France, who restored religion, defended her realm, and left no heir but her glory." As the candles dimmed in the abbey, the kingdom she had built began to reshape itself. The poets who had once filled her court now wrote elegies instead of sonnets. The dramatists, Shakespeare among them, turned her reign into myth. In the public imagination, she became something more than mortal, the embodiment of England itself, a nation crowned in gold and grief. Her image, once painted for politics, became relic. Every portrait, every medal, every faded page bearing her likeness was cherished as proof that such a woman had existed. Even the commoners who had never seen her in life now claimed her as their own. They told stories of her courage, her cunning, her laughter, her temper. In their telling, she became both saint and sovereign, warrior and mother. And that was perhaps her greatest victory, that she had made a people believe not just in a ruler, but in themselves. The courtiers of the new king would sometimes glance toward her old throne and fall silent. The air still carried her presence, the faint scent of rosewater, the whisper of silks. Some swore that on quiet nights, her footsteps could be heard in the galleries of Whitehall, pacing as she once had before addressing her people. A restless ghost, perhaps, or simply memory, refusing to fade. Her empire, though small compared to the realms of Spain or France, outlived them all. The ships she sent to sea became the roots of a global dominion. The poets she favored built the foundation of a language that would outlast empires. And the idea she embodied that power could wear a woman's face changed Europe forever. She had ruled in an age when men doubted that such a thing was possible. Yet through intellect, charisma, and sheer will, she had turned herself into the living argument that it was. When she declared herself married to England, she had not lied. For 4 decades, she had been both bride and guardian, giving her youth, her passion, and finally her peace to the realm that bore her name. Now that she was gone, England itself seemed newly orphaned. But every ending carries its echo. In the stillness after her death, that echo became prophecy, a whisper that would follow kings and queens for centuries. Rule, but never forget her. Elizabeth I left no heir of flesh, but an inheritance of spirit. It flowed through Shakespeare's pen, through Raleigh's voyages, through every voice that dared to speak truth to power. And though her body lay cold beneath the stones of Westminster, her legend only began to burn. The day after her burial, the clouds broke over London. For weeks, the skies had hung low and gray, as if mourning her. But now sunlight poured over the Thames, turning the river to molten gold. It was as though heaven itself had opened its gates to welcome the woman who had so long ruled beneath its shadow. News of her death spread slowly. Then, all at once, from the stone halls of Westminster to the far corners of Ireland, from the ports of Devon to the watchtowers of Calais, her name was spoken with reverence and disbelief. Elizabeth, the eternal queen, was gone. For those who had been born under her reign, and there were few left who hadn't, her absence was like the loss of a parent. They had known no other monarch. Her face had been on their coins, her voice in their prayers, her image in every church and tavern, her victories sung in the streets. To live without her was to step into a future uncharted. When James VI of Scotland crossed the border to become James I of England, he entered not merely a kingdom, but a memory. He found a court haunted by her ghost portraits on every wall, her motto, Semper Idem, still etched above doorways. Always the same. The courtiers bowed to him, but their eyes drifted to the empty throne. Even he, the son of her enemy, spoke of her with awe. He ordered her tomb to be honored, not hidden. He understood what many had not, that her legend was not a rival to his rule, but its foundation. For if England was to become more than a realm, if it was to become an empire, it needed a myth as enduring as Rome's, and Elizabeth had given it one. Time, which devours all things, could not touch her entirely. Within a generation, she ceased to be merely a queen of record and became an ideal Gloriana, the divine monarch of an age of light. Artists painted her in celestial armor, her eyes blazing with eternal youth. Poets called her Astrea, the goddess returned to bring justice to the world. Scholars argued that she had ruled by reason alone. Preachers claimed she had been guided by God. The truth that she was a woman of fear and fury, laughter and loneliness, was buried beneath the gilded myth. But myths have power, and hers would outlive them all. Even as the Stuart kings replaced her portraits with their own, the people still whispered her name. In the years of plague and fire that followed, Londoners would look back to her reign as a golden time, when poets sang and ships returned, laden with glory. When the smoke of civil war rose in the next century, rebels invoked her memory, the last monarch who had ruled for the people's love, not divine right. She became the England that England dreamed of being. Beyond her island, the empire she had imagined began to take shape. From the harbors of Plymouth, ships sailed to the New World carrying her flag, the Red Cross of St. George, that had flown above her Armada fleet. Across oceans and centuries, it would become the standard of an empire stretching from the Americas to India. The sailors who braved those seas spoke of her as if she still guided them. Her name was carved into their ships, whispered in storms, invoked before battles. She had once said she would make windows into men's hearts, and in a way she had done so, not by rule of sword or scripture, but by the power of vision. In literature, she became immortal. Shakespeare, who had seen her in life, wove her reflection into his queen's Cleopatra's wit, Titania's command, Lady Macbeth's iron will. The playwrights of the next age would look back at her reign as the birthplace of English drama itself, a time when the human spirit had found its voice. In later centuries, as revolutions toppled thrones across Europe, her story was retold again and again as the parable of a woman who had mastered her own fate. To Victorians, she became the model of imperial virtue. To modern historians, the first great female ruler of the Western world. To her own people, she remains something simpler and purer, good Queen Bess. But perhaps the truest image of Elizabeth lies not in oil or marble, but in the silence that followed her reign, that stillness in which her nation began to dream larger than its borders. She had ruled with words instead of armies, with pageantry instead of cruelty. She had turned her court into a theater where power itself was performance. And when she died, that performance became the foundation of a national identity. Her genius was not in conquest, but in creation of a myth strong enough to bind a people through centuries of change. The last Tudor was buried with no heir, yet her inheritance was infinite. She left behind not gold or sons, but imagination. She left a country that believed in destiny, and a language that would carry that belief across the world. In her, England had found its mirror flawed, radiant, enduring. And in her story, the world glimpsed the impossible made real. A woman, alone, commanding the tides of empire. 4 centuries later, her face still appears in stone and screen, in history books, and in the collective memory of the West. Her words, fierce, proud, trembling with purpose, echo through time. I know I have but the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. That defiance still burns in every story of power and every struggle for freedom. She is the ghost behind every woman who dares to lead, the echo behind every nation that dares to rise. And so the tale ends, as all tales of greatness do, not with a fall, but with a transformation. From mortal to myth, from queen to symbol, from Elizabeth Tudor to Gloriana eternal. Her throne stands empty, but her shadow still stretches across the centuries in the sails of ships, the pages of plays, the hearts of those who dream of more, for she ruled without a king and became one. If you followed Elizabeth's journey from the child of treason to the queen of empires, don't let her story fade. Like, share, and subscribe to keep history's greatest voices alive. Because every crown, every victory, every legend begins with a story worth remembering.